Sometimes the mind notices something before you do. A shift in the room, a silence that feels wrong. You tell yourself it's nothing because that's easier. The people in tonight's stories did the same, until they couldn't anymore. I'm LURK. Leave a like, subscribe, and let's begin. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. A few years ago, during the hot, sticky months of summer, I lived in a house that I will never forget. I only stayed there for about 3 months, but in that short amount of time, I experienced some of the most bizarre and terrifying things of my life. It was a student house located just a few blocks away from the Jesuit university where I was studying. It was one of those old, creaky houses that feels like it has been there forever, with paint peeling slightly in the corners and floorboards that groaned whenever you walked on them. That summer, the house was supposed to be quiet. Most of my roommates had left town. One was traveling with a youth group in Australia, having the time of his life. Another had gone back home to visit family for a few weeks. Another roommate had recently moved out completely, leaving an empty room. So, for the most part, it was just me. I was the lone occupant of this big, empty, echoing house. Well, I was mostly alone. I had one friend, a guy I will call Andre, who hung around with me quite a lot. We both had jobs on campus, so our schedules were similar. We would go to work in the morning, finish up around 5 or 6 in the evening, and then head back to the house to chill. It was a simple routine. We would watch movies, play video games, and just enjoy the freedom of having a place to ourselves. But one night, the routine changed. I didn't hang out with Andre that evening. Instead, I decided to go out with another friend of mine, a girl I will call Karen. There was a party happening that night, and Karen really wanted to go. I, on the other hand, had zero interest in going. I was tired, and a loud, crowded party was the last thing I wanted. But Karen was insistent. I knew that if I didn't go, she would go alone. I also knew that she planned to drink, and I didn't want her driving herself home late at night in that condition. So, being the responsible friend, I agreed to go. The party was exactly what I expected. Loud, sweaty, and chaotic. Karen had a great time. She drank way too much and got completely trashed. By the time the party was winding down, she was barely able to walk in a straight line. I guided her to her car, put her in the passenger seat, and drove us back to my place. On the way home, she mumbled that she didn't want to go all the way back to her house. Her place was about a 30-minute drive away, and she was in no condition to handle a long car ride. She asked if she could crash at my place. I said yes, of course. We got back to the house late. The street was quiet, and the house looked dark and looming against the night sky. I helped her inside and got her settled in the living room. I offered her one of the empty bedrooms. After all, almost everyone was gone, so there were plenty of beds available. But she was too drunk to understand what I was saying. She just collapsed onto the couch in the living room and refused to move. I grabbed a blanket, threw it over her, and made sure she had some water nearby. Once I was sure she was safe and asleep, I decided to retire to my own room. My room was unique. It wasn't actually inside the main house. It was a converted space in the backyard, part of a standalone garage unit. To get to it, you had to walk out the back door of the main house, cross the grassy yard, and follow a concrete car path that led out to the street. My room had a large sliding glass door as the main entrance. I liked it back there. It was private, quiet, and completely disconnected from the rest of the house. It felt like my own little sanctuary. I walked out the back door of the main house, locking it behind me. I crossed the dark yard, the grass damp with dew, and slid open the glass door to my room. The air inside was cool and still. I sat down at my computer, wanting to decompress after the loud party. I decided to smoke a little bit of weed to help me relax. I packed a bowl, smoked, and settled in for a quiet night of browsing the internet and listening to music. I chilled out there for about an hour. The time drifted by slowly. Around 2:01 in the morning, a thought crossed my mind. I should probably go check on Karen. She had been incredibly drunk, and I wanted to make sure she was okay. I wanted to check that she hadn't gotten sick or tried to wander off. I felt responsible for her. I stood up, stretched, and walked out of my sliding glass door. The night air was heavy. I crossed the yard again, walking toward the back door of the main house. The house was completely dark, a black shape against the slightly lighter sky. I reached the back door, turned the knob, and stepped inside. This is where things went wrong. As soon as my foot crossed the threshold into the house, the silence was shattered. First, I heard a shuffle. It sounded like feet scuffing against the floorboards, but then, almost instantly, it turned into something else. I heard what sounded like someone running, and not just jogging. This was a full-speed sprint. The sound was heavy and aggressive. It sounded like a large man running as fast as he could, right toward me. I froze. My hand was still on the doorknob. My heart slammed against my ribs, but as I stood there, paralyzed by the sound, my brain registered something that didn't make sense. The sound was wrong. The physics of it were impossible. The heavy, thudding footsteps were getting louder and closer, coming straight down the hallway toward the kitchen where I was standing. But there was no echo. There was no vibration on the floor. I realized with a jolt of absolute terror that the footsteps weren't coming from the floor. They were coming from the ceiling. It sounded exactly as if someone was running upside down, their heavy boots slamming against the plaster of the ceiling, rushing directly at my head. The sound was deafening in the quiet house. Thump, 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 thump. Then, just as the footsteps reached the spot directly above where I was standing, the running stopped abruptly. Silence for a split second, then crash. From down the hallway near the front of the house, I heard a massive noise. It sounded like dozens of heavy cardboard boxes being pushed over and tumbling down. It was a chaotic, loud, tumbling sound. It came from a specific room, the bedroom located just across the hall from the living room where Karen was sleeping. My mind started racing. I was freaking out. The weed I had smoked earlier was gone from my system, replaced instantly by pure adrenaline. My first thought wasn't ghosts. My first thought was that there was a maniac in the house. "Karen!" I called out. My voice sounded small and shaky in the dark kitchen. No answer. "Karen!" I yelled louder this time. Still no answer. A terrible cold feeling washed over me. I thought to myself, this is it. This is how I die. I was convinced that someone had broken in. I thought that whoever or whatever had made those footsteps had just attacked Karen. I imagined the worst. I thought she was probably already dead. I thought some psycho was hiding in the dark, waiting for me to walk down that hallway. My heart was beating so fast I thought I might pass out. I wanted to turn around, run back to my garage, lock the door and call the police. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave my friend in there. If she was hurt, if she was scared, I had to help her. I couldn't be a coward. I took a deep breath. I tried to talk myself down. I whispered to myself, "Okay, you smoked. You are paranoid. You are freaking out for no reason. It is all in your head. It is just you. Chill the fuck out. Go check on her. I forced my legs to move. I walked out of the kitchen and into the hallway. The house was pitch black, shadows stretching out in every direction. I walked toward the living room, listening intently for breathing, for movement, for the killer I was sure was waiting for me. I reached the living room and looked at the couch. It was empty. The blanket was tossed aside. Karen was gone. My panic spiked again. "Karen!" I started to shout, spinning around. And there she was. She was standing in the doorway of the bedroom where I had heard the boxes crashing. She was rubbing her eyes, looking sleepy and confused. "What are you doing?" she asked me in a groggy voice. I stared at her. I was breathless, sweaty, and terrified. "What the fuck?" I yelled, losing my cool completely. "What are you doing in there? Were you making all that noise?" She looked at me like I was insane. She blinked slowly, trying to process why I was yelling. I was asleep," she said. "I moved to the bed because the couch sucks. It's uncomfortable." I looked past her into the bedroom. I expected to see a disaster. I expected to see boxes overturned, furniture knocked down, chaos. I turned on the hallway light. The room was empty. There were no cardboard boxes. There was nothing on the floor. The room was perfectly tidy. The bed was rumpled, where she had been sleeping, but otherwise the room was silent and still. "Okay," I stammered, my brain trying to catch up. "But I heard all of this shit going on. Are you okay?" She shook her head. "I'm fine. I was sleeping." "You didn't hear anything at all?" I asked, desperate for her to confirm what I had experienced. "You didn't hear the running, the crashing?" "No," she said. "I didn't hear anything. Why? What's going on?" I looked at her face. She was telling the truth. She wasn't scared. She was just tired and hungover. I realized that if I told her I heard ghost footsteps running on the ceiling, she would freak out. I didn't want to scare her, and I didn't want to sound like a lunatic. "Okay," I said, forcing myself to calm down. "Okay, never mind. Just go back to bed. I'm sorry I woke you up." I watched her climb back into the bed and pull the covers up. She was asleep again in seconds. I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening. The house was dead silent. No creaks, no footsteps, just the heavy, suffocating silence of an old house. I turned off the light and walked back to my room in the garage. I ran across the yard. I locked the sliding glass door and double-checked it. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that heavy, upside-down sprinting sound rushing toward me. A few days passed. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was an animal on the roof. Maybe the weed had messed with my hearing more than I thought. Then Andre came over to hang out. We were sitting in the living room playing video games. I paused the game and turned to him. "Hey man," I said. "Something weird happened the other night." I told him the whole story. I told him about coming in from the garage, the footsteps on the ceiling, and the sound of the crashing boxes that didn't exist. I expected him to laugh at me. I expected him to tell me I was crazy. Instead, his face went pale. His eyes got wide. "Oh shit," he said. "Footsteps? Yeah, I've heard that." I looked at him squarely. "What? Are you serious?" I asked. I thought he might be messing with me. "No, I'm serious, man," he said, his voice lowering. "When I sleep over here, I hear shit all the time. I hear walking in the hallway when no one is up. I've wanted to tell you, but yeah. I mean, it makes me sound paranoid. I didn't want you to think I was weird." A chill went down my spine. It wasn't just me. "It is scary," I said to him. "How many stories people don't tell because they are afraid of sounding crazy." That conversation opened the floodgates. A few weeks later, the rest of the housemates returned from their trips. The house was full of people again. One night, we were all sitting around having dinner, and I mentioned the footsteps. As soon as I said it, everyone started talking. It turned out I wasn't the only one experiencing strange things. Everyone had a story. I hear scampering footsteps late at night, one roommate said. Usually between 2 or 3 hours in the morning. It sounds like someone running back and forth in the hall. Another roommate chimed in. Sometimes, he said, looking around the table to make sure we believed him. I will wake up before you guys in the morning. I'll go into the kitchen to make coffee and I'll find all the drawers and cabinets open, every single one. Just wide open. Nothing is missing. Nothing is messy. It's just like someone opened them all at once and left them there. We all sat there in silence. The image of walking into a kitchen and seeing every cabinet gaping open was terrifying. But the most messed up story came from the guy who had lived in the house the longest. He was the only one who had stayed there for the entire previous school year. He listened to our stories, nodding his head slowly. You know, he said quietly, the landlady told me something when I first moved in. We all leaned in. Her father used to live here, he said. He died about 5 years ago. He pointed down the hallway. He died in that room, the one across from the living room. My blood ran cold. That was the room where Karen had been sleeping. That was the room where I heard the massive crash of boxes. That was the room where the running footsteps had stopped. I swore I heard those boxes fall. I knew what I heard, and now I knew that I had been standing right outside the room where a man had died, listening to the echoes of something that wasn't there. The atmosphere in the house changed after that. We couldn't ignore it anymore. We were all on edge. Every creak, every shadow, every draft felt sinister. One of my housemates was particularly shaken. He had experienced the kitchen cabinets opening, and hearing the story about the death pushed him over the edge. He was a religious guy, and he decided he couldn't live like this anymore. He contacted a priest from the university. He asked him to come to the house. I had never seen anything like it. The priest arrived in his clerical collar carrying a small bag. He came into our messy student house and performed what basically amounted to an exorcism. I didn't know you could exorcise a house. I thought that was just for people in movies, but apparently you can bless and cleanse a place. The priest went from room to room. He hung a few crucifixes on the walls. He prayed in Latin. He splattered holy water in the corners of the rooms, especially in the hallway and the bedroom where the father had died. We all stood there watching awkwardly, hoping it would work. After he left, the house felt different. Maybe it was quiet. Maybe it was just the power of suggestion. I didn't stick around to find out if it lasted. My lease was up shortly after that summer ended. I packed up my stuff, moved out of the garage room, and got a new place as far away from that house as I could. I have never gone back. I have never asked the current residents if they hear running on the ceiling. I don't want to know. But sometimes late at night, when I am sitting in my quiet apartment, I think about that sound. I think about the heavy, impossible footsteps running upside down above my head, rushing toward me in the dark. And I am just glad I don't live there anymore. My grandma lives in a big old Victorian house in West Virginia, the kind of house that looks like it belongs in a painting or on the front cover of a history book. It's been in our family for around a century and a half. Nearly 150 years of people being born there, growing up there, growing old there, and dying there. The house has a certain weight, a certain presence, like it holds all those years inside its walls. There's no central heating or cooling, so in the summer, the upstairs gets hot and stuffy, and in the winter, the entire place feels like one big draft, no matter how many blankets you pile on. Creaky floors, heavy doors, tall windows that let in moonlight, and long, narrow hallways. It's the kind of house that feels alive, even when it's completely silent. My grandfather passed away a few years ago, but before he died, He shared a story about one of our ancestors who used to live in that house, some kind of great-great-great-grandfather from way back. He told the story the way old men sometimes do, slowly, with long pauses, like he was remembering every detail fresh. My family didn't always talk about the past in detail, but this was one of the few stories they all seemed to know something about. The kind passed down from generation to generation, whispered at the dinner table or during holidays when someone had one glass of wine too many. According to my grandfather, the house wasn't always full of people the way it is now. Sometimes family would go away for weeks at a time, leaving someone behind to watch the place. In the story he told, our great-great-great-grandfather was alone in the house one night. The rest of the family was away, and he had the place to himself. In a house that big, being alone means something different. Silence fills every room. Darkness seems deeper. Even the smallest sound becomes louder. He went to bed like normal, but sometime in the middle of the night, he woke up to a noise in the hallway outside his bedroom. Not a soft noise, not the kind of sound a house makes as it settles. According to my grandfather, it was a clear sound, something or someone moving around. The upstairs floor of the house has an unusual layout. There are two staircases, one leading down to the back of the house and one leading to the front. Between these two staircases is a short common hallway, but the stairs themselves are separated by a thick wall. Rooms branch off from both sides, so at night, shadows collect everywhere. The great-great-great-grandfather slept on the side near the back staircase. When he heard the sound, he sat up quickly. Houses make noises all the time, but he knew this one wasn't the house. His instinct told him it was something else. So he reached into the drawer of the nightstand beside his bed and grabbed the revolver he always kept there. People back then didn't think twice about having a gun in reach. It was just part of life. He opened his bedroom door. Across the hallway, through the dim light and the doorway of another room, he saw a figure, a white figure, standing in silence, not moving, not breathing, just standing there. His heart hammered inside his chest. The house was empty. He knew that. There was no reason anyone should be upstairs. No reason anyone should be in the hallway. He raised the revolver, aimed at the figure, and fired once. Then again. Then again. 6 shots. All 6. The flashes from the gun lit up the hallway like lightning. Each time the hallway lit up, he saw the white figure in front of him, still there, never reacting, never flinching, never falling. And then, as he stepped forward slowly, revolver still raised, it vanished. Completely, like stepping behind an invisible wall and disappearing. No sound, no movement, no trace. He walked closer, his hands shaking, ready to fire more shots, even though the gun was empty. When he reached the spot where the figure had been, nothing was there. No footprints, no torn fabric, no blood, no bullet holes in the wall behind it. The wood wasn't even chipped. It was as if he had fired into empty air. My grandfather always said that story with a serious face. No laughter, no jokes. He believed it. And the way he told it, you could tell that the whole family believed it too. Stories don't last 100 years unless there's something in them that people can't explain or forget. Years later, I had my own experience in that house, and it changed the way I thought about the story completely. I was visiting my grandma, staying the night in one of the guest bedrooms upstairs. My room was right above the foyer in the front of the house and the parlor next to it. I liked the room during the daytime because the window overlooked the street, and from up high you could see the old lampposts and the quiet road stretching down the hill. But at night, that room felt different. The shadows were deeper. The air was colder. The old wooden floor creaked under your feet, even if you moved slowly. I went to bed late that night, reading a book under the dim lamp beside the bed. My grandma always went to sleep early, so the house was completely silent. Outside, the moon shone so brightly that the street below looked almost blue. I remember checking the clock. It was a little after 3 in the morning. That was when I heard the voices. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was people on the street, maybe a group walking home from somewhere. The house faced the street, so it wasn't unusual to hear someone talking outside at night. But the voices kept going. They weren't fading, they weren't moving away, they were getting louder. I sat up in bed and listened. There were many voices together, low murmurs, louder bursts, laughter. I heard what sounded like children, adults, mixed in. It didn't sound like one group of people. It sounded like a crowd, like dozens of people talking over each other. The strange thing was, the sound wasn't coming from outside the window anymore. It was coming from below me, underneath the bed. My whole body froze. For a few seconds, I tried to convince myself that the voices were coming from the parlor beneath my room. Maybe the sound was traveling weirdly through the floorboards, but the longer I listened, the more certain I became. The voices were directly beneath my bed, not the room below. They were under me, in the floor itself, or in the air, or in the walls, like a gathering taking place inside the house, without anyone physically there. The laughter got louder. The children's voices were clearer, but I still couldn't make out a single word they were saying. It was like listening to a radio between stations, loud but impossible to understand. A sound that shouldn't make sense, but somehow does. I got up slowly and walked to the window. I didn't want to, but some part of me needed to look outside. I pressed my face to the glass. The street below was empty, completely empty. Not a single person, not a car, just pale moonlight on the pavement and the long shadows of trees. The voices continued under me, echoing upward like a crowd packed tightly into the floorboards. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The hair on my arms stood up. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I got back into bed and lay perfectly still, like any movement might draw attention to me. I pulled the covers up to my chin and stared at the ceiling. Every second felt long and heavy. After what felt like 5 minutes, maybe more, maybe less, the voices started to fade. First, the laughter softened. Then the children's voices echoed away. Then the murmurs dropped into silence. The moment the last whisper disappeared, the temperature in the room rose slightly, as if someone had opened a window that had been shut tight. I didn't sleep again until the sun was coming up, and I could hear my grandma downstairs making coffee. When I told her about the voices the next morning, she didn't laugh. She didn't tell me I imagined it. She didn't act surprised. She just nodded slowly, almost like she had heard something like that before, or like she already knew what I was talking about. I never asked her more. I didn't want to know, and I haven't slept in that room since. Something about that house holds the past, in a way I can't explain. Not just memories, not just stories, but sounds and shapes, and moments that don't belong to the world of the living anymore. And whatever passed through that house at 3 in the morning, it wasn't human. Where I grew up, there was one road everybody knew about, even if they pretended they didn't. Triple Lakes Road. People in town talked about it the same way they talked about local disasters, ghost stories, and secrets. Everyone knew someone who had crashed there, someone who had almost died there, someone who avoided it completely after dark. The road twisted through the woods like a living thing. It curved and dipped and climbed unpredictably, with sharp turns that came out of nowhere and drop-offs with no guardrails. For decades, teenagers and young adults would get drunk and drive along Triple Lakes Road to show off, thrill-seek, or test their luck. Many didn't make it home. Many families had stood by fresh graves because of that road. Over time, the accidents blended together in people's memories, but the stories, the legends, lived on. There were a lot of them. The old witch's house hidden deep in the trees, the red room in an abandoned building nearby, strange lights in the woods, screams people swore they heard at midnight, car engines dying without explanation. My friends and I always had a million creepy stories about the place. We went exploring, partly because we were bored teenagers, partly because we thought we were braver than everyone else, and partly because we liked scaring each other. And honestly, we had some scary experiences on that road. Too many to write down at once. But the one that still makes my stomach twist happened at a place on Triple Lakes Road known as Hernando's Bridge. Even the name sounded wrong, like something out of a horror movie. The legend said that back in 1969, a man named Hernando murdered his own family and hung their bodies from meat hooks underneath the bridge. People said he was mentally unstable or possessed, or influenced by something in the woods. The stories changed depending on who told them, but all versions agreed on one thing. Something terrible happened on that bridge. Whether any of it was true or exaggerated over time, no one really knew. Some old newspaper reports suggested a family tragedy happened near there around that time, but no one could ever confirm the worst parts of the story. What mattered to people wasn't the facts, it was the feeling. Everyone who grew up there knew the dread surrounding that bridge. They also said that if you drove across Hernando's Bridge at night, with your headlights turned off, you would hear screaming from underneath. Some said they heard crying. Some said they heard voices begging for help. Some said they heard banging on the underside of their car, as if someone was hanging there. My friends and I tried the headlights off trick several times. Nothing happened. We always ended up laughing it off, saying maybe the ghosts didn't like us, or maybe the stories were all made up. But one night, everything changed. One summer weekend, around midnight, we decided to drive to the bridge, just to mess around and see if we could scare ourselves for fun. There were 5 of us, me, my friend Tim, 2 other guys, and a girl who was close with all of us. We'll call her Sarah. She was a spiritualist, someone who said she had seen ghosts and dealt with dark experiences since childhood. She didn't brag about it. She didn't exaggerate. She actually avoided talking about it unless someone asked. And because she was usually calm and reasonable, we believed her more than we believed most people. As we approached the bridge, everything felt strange. Triple Lakes Road was already dark at night, but this particular stretch felt different. The road leading to the bridge was open at first, the sky visible above us. But as the bridge got closer, the trees began closing in overhead, bending toward each other like tall shadows leaning in to whisper. The branches tangled above the road, creating a tunnel that blocked out the moonlight. The car headlights cut through the darkness, but even they seemed weaker under that canopy of trees. There were no houses nearby, no driveways, no parked cars, just road, trees, and darkness. My friend parked about 20 yards before the bridge. The car sat in the middle of the road with the headlights shining forward. They weren't enough to illuminate everything, just enough to show the narrow road, the wooden railing of the bridge, and the beginning of the slope that led down underneath it. We all got out of the car. The air was warm but felt heavy, like the humidity had settled low to the ground. Every sound we made echoed unusually loud. Footsteps on gravel, the slam of the car door, the rustle of leaves. Someone said, "Let's go down under it." We all agreed, though none of us really wanted to. We started walking down the dirt slope toward the underside of the bridge. The beam from the headlights stretched only partway down, and the rest was swallowed by darkness. The trees rustled quietly, even though there was hardly any wind. The night felt thick, like the woods were holding their breath. But then Sarah suddenly stopped walking. She froze like she hit an invisible wall. She started shaking violently, like her whole body was being pulled in different directions. She fell to her knees, planted her hands in the dirt, and burst into tears. "We need to go back," she said. "We need to go back right now." Her voice wasn't normal. It sounded terrified, small, trembling. We all stopped, confused and worried. She had never acted like this before, ever. She was usually the calmest person in the group, the one who comforted everyone else. Seeing her like that made something cold slide down my spine. I reached for her arm to help her stand, but she screamed, "No," so loudly and sharply it felt like the sound stabbed right through me. I let go immediately. She kept shaking her head over and over. She said something was wrong, something bad, something dangerous. She didn't want to explain. She wouldn't look at us. Just kept repeating that we needed to get back in the car. We stood around her for a minute or two trying to calm her down. Eventually she stopped shaking, but she refused to move from that spot. We convinced her to wait by the car where she felt safe. She wiped her face, hugged her knees to her chest, and sat on the ground near the headlights. We should have listened to her. We should have gotten back in the car, but we didn't. We were young, stupid, and way too curious. As soon as she was sitting safely by the road, the rest of us kept going. We walked down the slope like four idiots trying to laugh off the fear tightening in our chests. The deeper we went, the darker it got. The bridge loomed above us like a giant black shadow. The air got cooler. The woods around us felt strangely quiet, not silent but muted, like we were hearing everything through a thick wall. Then I heard it, whispering. At first it sounded like distant voices, several of them soft and muffled. I thought maybe there were teenagers down there partying, maybe sitting around a bonfire or smoking something. The whispers sounded too casual to be ghosts, too normal. But as we got closer to the underside of the bridge, something felt off. The whispering wasn't English. It wasn't even like a real language. It was a jumble of sounds, overlapping voices, speaking at different speeds, different tones, all layered on top of each other. Some voices were high-pitched, some were low, some sounded like they were right next to my ear, others sounded like they were far away. It didn't sound like people having a conversation. It sounded like a crowd of voices whispering over each other on purpose, weaving together into something unsettling and wrong. We slowed down. All four of us heard it. Our breathing got faster. My hands started sweating. The hairs on my arms stood up. But we kept going. We wanted to see the people under the bridge. We wanted to talk to them. If there really was a group down there, they might have known something about the rumors or the legend. Maybe we could ask them if they heard anything weird before we arrived. But when we reached the bottom of the slope and looked under the bridge, there was no one there. Just shadows. Just graffiti. Just us. The whispering stopped immediately, not gradually, not slowly, instantly, just gone. We looked around, trying to find footprints or beer cans or anything that proved someone had been there. Nothing. The dirt was untouched. The ground was empty. The air felt colder, heavier, stiller. All four of us were scared now. Even Tim, who was usually the bravest, looked shaken. But he did something that made everything worse. He yelled out, "Hello!" His shout echoed loudly under the bridge, bouncing off the walls of the woods. Then everything went quiet, completely quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. For a few seconds we stood there frozen. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, somewhere far away but loud enough to reach us, a woman screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. It was sharp, painful, full of terror. It sounded like a woman in absolute agony, like she was being attacked, hurt, or murdered. The kind of scream that hits you in your chest and doesn't let go. The kind of scream you never forget. We didn't even look at each other. We didn't say a single word. We just ran. We ran up the hill so fast we were slipping on dirt, grabbing branches, pushing each other out of the way. We sprinted to the car, threw ourselves inside, slammed the doors, and locked them all at once. My friend floored the gas pedal so hard, we almost crashed into a tree as we sped away. The tires screeched on the pavement. We didn't breathe or speak until we had driven miles down the road and reached a well-lit area. We were shaking, pale, sweating. None of us have gone back to Hernando's Bridge since. And even now, years later, when I think about the whispering, the empty darkness, and that scream ripping through the woods, my skin still crawls. Some stories stay legends, but some become personal. This happened when I was around 10 years old, but even now, so many years later, the memory is still sharp in my mind. It comes back to me in flashes. The bright sunlight on the sea, the quiet sound of waves far below the cliffs, the long stretch of the footpath, the laughter of kids, and then that cottage, that strange old cottage, and the thing we saw inside it. Every part of that day was normal until it suddenly wasn't. And once it wasn't, it became one of the clearest, scariest moments of my childhood. Our school decided to take us on a long walk along the cliffs by the sea toward a nearby village. It was supposed to be a fun, simple outing. The teachers kept saying how lucky we were because the weather was perfect. Bright blue sky, not a single cloud, and a cool breeze blowing in from the ocean. The sea stretched out forever, shiny and calm. And every so often we would stop just to look at it. The walk was long for little kids, maybe 3 or 4 miles, but we didn't care. When you're 10, distance feels different. Everything feels like part of an adventure. All the kids were scattered across the footpath. Some rushed forward, some walked slowly, some kept stopping to pick flowers or look over the edge of the cliff. Teachers and volunteer helpers walked beside us, making sure no one wandered off or got too close to the drop. I was walking with 3 of my closest friends at the time. We were somewhere near the back of the group, half chatting, half kicking stones along the path. Behind us was an older student, a teenager who had volunteered to help the teachers. He probably didn't even want to be there, but he was supposed to watch us and make sure none of us accidentally fell off the cliffs or did something stupid. He didn't pay attention most of the walk. He had headphones on half the time, pretending not to hear us. We didn't mind. Kids like us were happy to be mostly free. As the walk went on, we reached the highest point of the cliffs, a place where the land leveled out into a flat area with fields stretching away from the edge. That was where we saw it, a cottage, a very simple one. Square shape, white walls, small windows, 2 stories tall. It sat alone in a field like it had been forgotten there. No cars around, no garden, no signs of anyone living there. Just empty fields and the sound of distant waves crashing far below. From far away, it looked ordinary, old but ordinary. Maybe a farmer's house from long ago that had never been torn down. But as we got closer, we noticed how worn down it really was. The paint on the walls had peeled in big patches. Some of the window frames looked crooked. The grass around it was overgrown, and there were no signs that anyone had taken care of it in a long time. Then we noticed something else. The front door was open. Not wide open, just slightly pushed inward, like someone might have walked in or walked out recently. The wind made it move a little, gently creaking. 10-year-old kids are curious by nature, and we were definitely no exception. We slowed down, looked at each other, whispered, "Was anyone inside? Could we look? Should we go in?" The teenage helper behind us clearly didn't care. He was 10 steps behind, kicking dirt and looking bored. He wasn't paying attention. No adults were nearby. So naturally, we did exactly what we weren't supposed to do. We went inside. We pushed the door open a little more. It groaned loudly, like it hadn't moved in a long time. The air inside felt different, cooler, stale, like a place that had been shut tight for many years. The cottage was empty. Completely empty. No furniture, no carpet, no curtains. Just dusty floors and plain walls. A couple of small rooms on the bottom level, and a narrow wooden staircase leading to the upper floor. The four of us stepped inside slowly. Every sound echoed in the empty space. Our footsteps sounded too loud. The floorboards creaked under our weight. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and the sea. "Maybe someone used to live here," one of my friends whispered. "Maybe it's abandoned," another said. We didn't talk loudly. Somehow the house didn't feel like a place where you should make noise. We tiptoed from room to room, looking at the empty walls, imagining who might have lived there decades ago. Then we saw the staircase. It was narrow, old and dusty, with worn-down wooden steps. It led up into a small landing we could barely see from where we stood. We looked at each other, and because we were brave in the way only children can be, we started climbing. The stairs creaked with every step. Dust floated in the air as we walked. Halfway up, I felt the strange sensation of being watched, the tiny, prickling feeling on the back of your neck. I brushed it off as nerves. It was an old house. Old houses feel like that. At the top of the stairs was a small landing with 2 bedroom doors. The door directly in front of us was open, and leaning against the wall across from it, almost exactly at our eye level, was a large old mirror. Not a modern mirror, not the kind you find at home. The frame was chipped. The glass was spotted. It looked like it had survived decades without ever being cleaned or moved. We could see ourselves in it. 4 kids standing in a dusty landing, looking tired and curious, breathing a little fast because we walked up the stairs too quickly. Then we saw something else. In the mirror behind us was the reflection of a man, a grown man, tall, broad, standing a few feet behind us in the doorway at the top of the stairs, except when we turned around, there was no one there. Just the landing, just the walls, just the empty bedroom, just us. We froze. No one breathed. We turned back to the mirror. The man was still there, not moving fast, but moving toward us slowly, one step at a time. His face wasn't clear. His clothes weren't clear. Everything about him looked hazy, like he was covered in shadows, even though we were standing in bright daylight, coming through the upstairs window. But he was real enough, solid enough, close enough that my stomach dropped and every part of me screamed to run. I don't remember which one of us moved first. Maybe we all moved at the same time. Suddenly the landing erupted in chaos. Gasps, panicked breaths, footsteps pounding on old wood. We shoved each other, bumped shoulders, scrambled down the stairs as fast as our legs would move. The staircase felt too narrow, the walls felt too close, the house felt too small. I remember nearly tripping on the last step. One of my friends pushed the door open so hard it slammed against the wall. We burst out into the sunlight, into the fresh air, into the open field. None of us looked back. We ran, hard, fast, like something was chasing us. Our feet slammed against the path. Our breath burned our lungs. My legs felt like jelly, but I couldn't stop. None of us could. We ran across the field, back toward the footpath, away from the cottage, away from the cliffs, away from whatever we had seen. We caught up with the rest of the group half a mile later. The teachers told us to slow down, asked what we were doing, why we were running. We didn't answer. We couldn't. We were too out of breath and too terrified. For the rest of the walk, we stayed in the middle of the group. We didn't wander, we didn't explore, we didn't talk much. Every time I blinked, I saw the man's shadowy figure again, standing behind us. Not in the house, not in real life, but in my mind, like a burnt image that refused to fade. We never went near that cottage again. Whenever the path led close to it on future school walks, I made sure to look straight ahead and pretend it wasn't there. Even now, as an adult, when I think back on that day, my skin crawls. I can't explain what we saw. Maybe it was some trick of light. Maybe our imaginations made it worse. but the mirror showed something that wasn't in the room, something moving, something looking at us. And if we hadn't run, I don't know what would have happened. I only know one thing for sure. I have never trusted mirrors in old, empty houses since. My mom used to tell me stories about the house she and my dad rented in North Carolina when I was just a baby. I was less than a year old at the time, so of course I remember nothing. Growing up, I always thought my mom exaggerated things because she drank a lot and liked telling dramatic stories. She would describe strange noises, people standing in the hallway, cold spots in the living room, and shadows that moved on their own. I didn't take it seriously. I thought she was just trying to scare me or make her life sound more interesting. Years later, when I was older, I brought it up with my dad. I expected him to roll his eyes and say something like, "You know how your mom is." But instead, he sat quietly for a moment and nodded. Then he told me a story that matched hers almost exactly, except his version was calmer, clearer, and much scarier because of how normal he made it sound. He was not someone who believed in ghosts, and he rarely talked about anything unusual. So hearing him describe that night in detail made the whole thing real in a way my mom's stories never did. Back then, my dad worked graveyard shifts. He went into work at night and came home in the early morning. My mom worked mornings, so they had a system. He would come home around 4 a.m., and she would leave shortly after. That way, someone was always home with me. My dad said that on the night this happened, nothing felt unusual at first. He came home the same way he always did. He parked the car, walked up the small path to the front porch, unlocked the door, and stepped into the dim, quiet house. The living room was dark except for a faint glow from the porch light leaking through the curtains. He set his keys down on the counter, kicked off his shoes, and collapsed onto the couch. He was exhausted. He said graveyard shifts were brutal, the kind of tired that feels heavy in your bones. Lying there with his eyes half closed was our dog, a white German shepherd named Deny. She was loyal, smart, and protective. She hardly ever barked or growled unless something was really wrong. My dad trusted that dog more than most people. He always said if Deny reacted to something, you reacted too. My dad was drifting off to sleep on the couch when he heard my mom getting ready for work. He wasn't fully awake, just aware enough to hear doors opening and closing, feet moving around the kitchen, the soft sound of clothing being pulled on. He kept his eyes shut, thinking he would just rest for a minute while she finished getting ready. My mom left like usual, and the house went silent. He fell asleep. A short time later, he wasn't sure if it was minutes or an hour. He felt the sensation that someone was near him. You know that strange instinct you get when someone is standing close, even if you're not looking. He felt that. It pulled him halfway out of sleep. His eyes opened slightly, heavy with fatigue. Someone was standing over him. A figure, a person. Not sitting. Not walking past. Standing directly over the couch, looking down at him. His first thought was that it was my mom. Maybe she forgot something. Maybe she needed help with something. Maybe she wasn't done getting ready. He blinked slowly, still half asleep, and the figure turned and moved down the hallway toward my bedroom. My room was at the end of the hall, a small space with a crib, a dresser, and a rocking chair. I slept there every night. My dad said he didn't panic at first. He simply thought my mom needed to check on me before she left. The figure was not in a hurry. It just walked calmly toward my door. My dad closed his eyes for a second, trying to wake up fully. He told me later that he had that heavy, foggy feeling you get when you're exhausted and waking up too fast. But then something happened that snapped him awake instantly. Deny, the dog, jumped to her feet. She stood at the edge of the couch, staring down the hallway, ears forward, body stiff. Her hair lifted along her back. She growled, a low, deep growl that my dad said he had only heard once or twice in her entire life. It was the sound an animal makes when it is terrified but ready to fight. My dad sat up straight, all the tiredness gone in an instant. His heart started pounding. He looked at the hallway. The lights were off. The shadows were thick. The figure he thought was my mom was gone. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. Denai growled louder. My dad looked toward the front door and saw something that made his stomach drop. The door was slightly open, not wide, just cracked. Enough that the cold air from outside drifted into the living room. My mom would never leave it open. She was always careful, always locked it behind her. She would close it, check it, double-check it. He shouted her name. No answer. Denai barked now, one sharp, angry bark. Then she ran toward the hallway, stopping at the edge as if she was too scared to go any farther. My dad followed her with his heart thudding hard in his chest. He said every part of him suddenly felt awake, too awake, in the way you only feel when adrenaline and fear meet at the same time. He pushed open the door to my room. He expected, in the worst part of his mind, to find a stranger holding me, or hurting me, or even worse. He was ready to fight. He said he didn't even think about being afraid for himself. Only for me. He ran into the room prepared for anything, but what he found made no sense. No one was in the room. There was no stranger, no shadowy figure, no signs of a break-in, no footprints, nothing. But the room itself was a disaster. All the furniture, the dresser, the rocking chair, the little side table, everything had been shoved up against the far wall near the window. The crib had been pushed too, tilted at an angle, smashed against the dresser. My toys were scattered everywhere. Blankets were on the floor. The curtains were blowing inward. The window was open, wide open. Cold morning air swept into the room and made the curtains billow. The window looked out into the dark yard. Nothing was outside. Nothing was below the window. Nothing was moving. Then he saw me. I was standing in the middle of my crib, not holding the railing, not leaning on anything. Just standing straight up, my little baby hands clenched tightly at my sides, screaming at the top of my lungs. He said I looked absolutely terrified, not crying the way babies cry when they're hungry or tired, crying like something had scared me down to my bones, like I'd seen something too big for my small mind to understand. My face was red, my mouth wide open, tears pouring down my cheeks. He scooped me up instantly. He checked the window frame, the floor, the hall, anything that might show how the furniture had moved, or who had been in the house. There was nothing, no footprints, no scratches, no muddy shoes, no signs of someone climbing in or out, no signs of forced entry at the front door, no broken locks, no fingerprints, no nothing. But something had been there. Something had walked down that hallway. Something had stood over him while he slept. Something had gone into my room. Something had pushed heavy furniture across the floor in total silence. Something had opened the window. And something had scared me so badly that I screamed until my voice broke. When my mom came home later and my dad told her everything, she insisted she had locked the door. She remembered turning the bolt. She remembered pulling on the door to make sure it was shut. She even remembered checking it twice because she was rushing that morning. My dad didn't argue. He believed her, but he also believed his own eyes. He still accuses her sometimes, only jokingly, of leaving the door open, but the truth is, neither of them thinks she did. The lock worked fine. The door didn't have a draft problem. It had never opened on its own before. When my dad talked about that night, the part that frightened him most wasn't the open door or the window or the missing figure. It wasn't even the furniture shoved to one side. It was Denai, the dog. He said the look in her eyes, the way her hair stood up. the way she growled from deep in her chest. It was the kind of reaction an animal has when it senses something humans can't, something dangerous, something wrong, something they want to attack but also want to run away from. He said Denai was never the same after that night. She became more protective, more alert, more restless. She paced a lot. She slept in the doorway of my room every night afterward. She never relaxed in that house again. My parents moved out not long after. Even now, when I think about that story, I feel a chill go down my back. Whatever happened that night, whoever or whatever was in that house, it left a mark on my family. Not something you can see, not something you can explain, but something real enough to be remembered decades later. And sometimes I wonder what I saw as a baby, what I was looking at when I stood there screaming, what I watched while someone or something moved all the furniture in silence, what walked down that hallway and stood over my sleeping father. I don't remember the event, but something deep inside me reacts when I hear that story, like a memory buried too far to reach. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily. In my hometown, there is a place that everyone knows about, but very few people like to visit after the sun goes down. It is a large, sprawling graveyard that sits right on the edge of town, bordered by a wide, dark river that moves slowly and silently. The geography of the place is important to understand why it feels so unsettled. There is a large open field right next to the graveyard, a patch of green land where the local high school kids have hung out for generations. Separating the field from the graves is a massive stone wall. It is an old, imposing structure, standing about 8 feet high, built from rough, dark stones that look like they have been there for hundreds of years. Over time, nature has tried to reclaim the wall. Thick shrubbery and ivy grow all over it, climbing up the sides and spilling over the top. The plants are dense and tangled, reaching out about a meter or two from the wall itself, creating a sort of green canopy that hangs over the edge of the field. During the day, it just looks like an overgrown garden, but at night, those bushes cast long, strange shadows that look like reaching hands. Ever since I was about 10 years old, my brother and I have had a fascinating interest in a specific story my dad used to tell us. It was not a bedtime story meant to comfort us. It was a true story, a memory from his youth that clearly still bothered him, even if he tried to laugh it off. We would beg him to tell it whenever we drove past that old graveyard. The story goes back about 30 years. My dad was 17 at the time, living the typical life of a teenager in a small town. One summer night, he was hanging out in that field next to the graveyard wall. It was him, his girlfriend at the time, and a whole load of other friends. They were doing what teenagers do, talking, laughing, maybe drinking a little bit, just enjoying the freedom of being young and out late. It was around 2 in the morning. The night was incredibly still. My dad always emphasizes this part of the story. He says there was absolutely no wind that night. The air was heavy and stagnant. The trees were perfectly still and the grass wasn't moving. It was dead calm. Suddenly, the conversation in the group died down because someone noticed something strange. The thick bushes growing on top of the 8-foot wall started shaking. It wasn't just a little rustle. The shrubs were shaking violently, thrashing back and forth as if something was physically grabbing them and yanking them around. The group of friends went silent. They looked at the trees nearby. Nothing was moving. They looked at the grass. Still. There was no breeze at all. Yet this one specific patch of shrubbery on the graveyard wall was moving like it was caught in a hurricane. The kids were baffled. They were all staring at it, trying to figure out what could be causing it. Some of the girls started getting scared, whispering that they should leave. But my dad was 17, and he was with his girlfriend. He had an image to maintain. He wanted to be the tough guy, the protector. He couldn't just run away from a shaking bush. He saw it as a challenge, an opportunity to show off his bravery. So, puffing out his chest, he told everyone to calm down. He said he would go check it out. His girlfriend, perhaps not wanting to be left alone with the scared group, or maybe wanting to be part of the adventure, decided to go with him. They left the safety of the group in the field and walked along the length of the massive wall. The shaking was still coming from the other side, from inside the graveyard. To see what it was, they had to go all the way around to the main entrance. They found the old iron gate that led into the cemetery. It was unlocked, as it usually was back then. They pushed it open, the hinges groaning in the silence of the night. Stepping into the graveyard changed the atmosphere immediately. The air felt colder inside the walls. The moonlight cast pale beams on the headstones, making them glow against the dark grass. They walked slowly, trying to be quiet, stepping over roots and navigating through the rows of graves. They made their way toward the back wall, toward the spot where the river flowed just on the other side, and where the bushes were located. As they got closer to the wall, they could hear the rustling sound getting louder. It was a frantic scratching noise, leaves slapping against leaves. My dad said his heart started beating a little faster, but he kept going. They approached the specific bush, which was quite close to the edge of the property, where the land dropped off into the river. They stopped a few feet away. My dad squinted into the darkness. It was late, and the shadows were deep, so he couldn't see details clearly, but he could see shapes. He looked up at the bush. There, sitting in the tangled branches and leaves, was a figure. It wasn't an animal. My dad grew up in the country. He knew what a fox, a badger, or a stray dog looked like. This wasn't that. He described it as a humanoid figure, but it was small. He estimated it was about 4 feet tall. It was crouching in the bush, using its hands to violently shake the branches back and forth. Because of the darkness, he could only see the outline. It looked like a small person, entirely black, just a silhouette against the night sky. My dad stood there, frozen. His brain tried to process what he was seeing. Was it a person? A prank? But who would be sitting in a graveyard bush at 2 a.m, silently shaking it? It wasn't a drunk friend. They were all back in the field. It couldn't be a little kid playing a prank. No parent would let their child out in a graveyard at that hour, and the figure was too small to be a teenager or an adult. The figure didn't make a sound. It didn't giggle or shout. It just kept shaking the bush, violently and rhythmically. A sudden primal fear washed over my dad. The hair on his arms stood up. He grabbed his girlfriend's hand, and the urge to be a tough guy evaporated instantly. He screamed, or maybe she screamed, he can't remember, and they turned and ran. They ran like hell. They sprinted back through the graveyard, stumbling over the uneven ground, not caring about the noise they were making. They burst through the gate, ran back around the wall, and didn't stop until they reached the group of friends in the field. They were breathless and pale. They told their friends they needed to leave, right now. They didn't even fully explain what they saw until they were safely in a car and driving away. They never went back to investigate. They never found out what it was. But my dad always stuck to his story. It was too small to be a man, too big to be a typical animal, and way too strange to be anything natural. That story became a part of our family lore. We loved it because it was scary, but also because it was hard to imagine our dad, who was a logical and practical man, running away from a bush. Years passed. Life moved on, as it always does. My dad grew up. He got married, had 2 kids, me and my brother, and eventually went through a divorce. He moved away from that small hometown and settled in Birmingham, a big city far away from the quiet, creepy fields of his youth. But he never forgot that night. Whenever we visited our grandparents who still lived in the hometown, my dad would sometimes drive us past the area. He showed me and my brother the exact spot. I know where it is now. I have stood in that field. Even in the daylight, Looking at that 8-foot wall with the overhanging shrubbery, the place creeps the fuck out of me. The river still runs dark and slow nearby, and the silence there still feels heavy. This is where the story takes a turn from just a spooky memory to something truly chilling. Recently, my family gathered for my grandparents' wedding anniversary. It was a nice occasion. We were all together, my dad, my brother, me, and our grandparents. We had finished a big dinner and were sitting around the table with cups of tea, feeling full and happy. The conversation naturally turned to the past. We started reminiscing about childhood memories, the trouble we used to get into, and the silly things we did. Somehow, the topic shifted to danger. We started talking about near-death experiences. My dad has had a few of them in his life. He was a bit of a wild child. We were talking about one particular incident where he nearly drowned when he was a teenager, swimming where he shouldn't have been. My grandmother, nodding along, started talking about the dangers of the local waters. She has a memory like a steel trap. She remembers everything that happened in the town for the last 50 years. She started talking about how dangerous that specific river next to the graveyard was. "Do you remember," she asked my grandfather, "that poor little mite who drowned there years ago? It was all over the papers." My ears perked up. My dad looked at her. "Which one?" he asked. "Oh, it was a terrible tragedy," my grandmother said, her voice dropping to a respectful whisper. "A little toddler, a boy, I think. He wasn't more than 3 or 4 years old." She went on to explain the details. Apparently back in the day, a local family had lost track of their young child. The kid had wandered off. He had climbed up onto that big stone wall, the one separating the field from the graveyard. He was playing up there, as kids do, not understanding the danger. He had slipped. He fell from the wall, but he didn't fall into the field. He fell on the other side, down the steep bank and straight into the river. Because it was secluded and the water was deep and slow, no one heard him. He drowned right there in the shadow of the graveyard wall. My dad went completely pale. The table went silent. My brother and I looked at each other, and then we looked at our dad. We were all doing the math in our heads. The toddler was 3 or 4 years old. That would make him about 3 or 4 feet tall. The child fell from the wall near the river. That was the exact spot where the bush was. The incident my grandmother was talking about happened a few years before my dad was 17. The timeline fit perfectly. My dad sat there, his cup of tea hovering halfway to his mouth. He looked like he had seen a ghost all over again. For 34 years he had told this story about the 4-foot figure in the bush. He had joked about it, puzzled over it, and tried to rationalize it. But he had never connected it to a real tragedy. He had never known about the little boy who died on that exact spot. For the first time in 34 years, he decided to tell his parents about his experience. "Mom, Dad," he started, his voice a little shaky. "I never told you this, but when I was 17, he told them everything. He told them about the windless night. He told them about the shaking bush. He told them about going into the graveyard with his girlfriend. And he told them in detail about the small 4-foot figure he saw sitting in the bushes, shaking the branches violently right above the river. When he finished, the room was dead silent. My grandmother put her hand over her mouth. My grandfather just stared at him. It suddenly made sense in the most horrifying way. The figure my dad saw wasn't a monster. It wasn't an alien. It wasn't a prank. It was a small child. A child who had died playing on that wall. A child who, perhaps, was still trying to play, shaking the bushes in the middle of the night, forever stuck in the place where he fell. Everyone was a bit creeped out, to say the least. The cozy anniversary dinner had turned into something much heavier. We didn't stay up much longer after that. The drive back to our hotel that night felt longer than usual. I still think about it often. I think about my dad being 17, trying to be brave for his girlfriend, walking into the dark. I think about him staring at that small, dark outline, and I wonder if he had stayed a little longer if he hadn't run away. Would the figure have turned around? And if it had, would he have seen the face of a drowned toddler staring back at him? It is strange how stories evolve. For most of my life, it was just Dad's ghost story. It was a bit of fun. But now, knowing the history, knowing that a real life was lost right there, it feels different. It feels sadder, and it feels much, much more real. The next time I go back to my hometown, I don't think I will visit that field. I don't think I want to see the wall or the river. I am happy to leave that place to the memory of the little boy and whatever else might be walking around in the dark at 2 in the morning. Some things are better left alone. It was the middle of winter and the world outside was covered in a thick blanket of snow. It was that specific time of year that always feels a little bit magical and a little bit lazy, Christmas break. My sister and I were both back home from college, enjoying the break from exams, dorm rooms, and responsibilities. There is a certain kind of comfort that you only get when you are back in your parents' house. The fridge is always full, the heating is always on, and you feel like a kid again, even if you are technically an adult. We were staying up late, which was our tradition whenever we were home together. The rest of the house was dark and quiet. My parents had gone to sleep hours ago, retreating to their bedroom upstairs. My sister and I were downstairs in the den, curled up on the comfortable old couches, watching late-night TV with the volume turned down low, so we wouldn't wake anyone up. The only light in the room came from the flickering glow of the television screen and the colorful Christmas tree lights twinkling in the corner of the living room next door. Because we were home and bored and perhaps feeling a little bit rebellious against the wholesome family atmosphere, we had decided to get high. We smoked a little bit of weed, just enough to make the terrible late-night movies seem funny and to make us feel incredibly relaxed. We were giggling at nothing, whispering jokes to each other, and enjoying the warm, fuzzy feeling of being safe at home. But as anyone who has ever smoked knows, eventually the hunger sets in. The munchies hit us hard. We started talking about food. We listed all the things in the pantry, but nothing sounded quite right. Then we remembered the fudge. My mother made this incredible homemade fudge every year for Christmas. It was rich, creamy, and packed with chocolate. She had made a fresh batch earlier that day, specifically for a big family party that was happening the next afternoon. She had poured the hot fudge onto a large ceramic plate to let it cool and harden, and she had covered it carefully with a layer of clear plastic wrap. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, strictly off limits until the party. We looked at each other. We knew we shouldn't touch it. We knew Mom would be annoyed if we messed up the presentation before the guests arrived. But the craving was too strong. We decided we would just be very, very sneaky about it. We crept into the kitchen like ninjas. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the streetlights casting shadows through the window above the sink. The house was dead silent. We tiptoed over to the counter where the holy grail of snacks was waiting. We carefully peeled back the plastic wrap, trying not to make too much noise. The smell of chocolate hit us immediately. We grabbed a butter knife and performed surgery on the fudge. We didn't just hack into the middle of it. We were smarter than that. We carefully cut off small, thin slivers from around the very edge of the block. We smoothed out the sides with the knife so that it looked perfectly untouched. We ate the pieces quickly, savoring the sugar rush. When we were done, we pulled the plastic wrap back over the plate, smoothing it out so it looked tight and pristine, just like Mom had left it. We high-fived each other for our stealthiness and went back to the den. After a while, the sleepiness started to take over. I looked at the clock and realized it was getting late. I was also waiting for a phone call from my boyfriend at the time. Back then, we didn't all have cell phones glued to our hands, so I had to use the landline. I decided I wanted to be in my own bed when he called so I could talk privately. I told my sister goodnight. She was still wide awake, watching some infomercial on the TV, looking comfortable on the couch. I grabbed the cordless phone handset from the base in the kitchen and headed upstairs. I walked through the dark hallway, climbed the stairs, and went into my bedroom. I closed the door, climbed into my warm bed, and pulled the covers up. I felt safe and happy. I stared at the phone, waiting for it to ring, drifting in and out of a light doze. I don't know exactly how much time passed. It might have been an hour, it might have been 2. The house was completely silent. Then my bedroom door burst open. I jolted awake, my heart slamming against my ribs. My sister came running into my room. She wasn't walking, she was sprinting. She slammed the door shut behind her and practically dove onto my bed. It was dark, but even in the shadows, I could see that something was wrong. She was panic-stricken. Her eyes were wide and she was shaking violently. She was gasping for air, but she wasn't screaming. She was whispering. She was terrified to make a sound. "Give me the phone," she hissed, her voice trembling. "Where is the phone? Give it to me." I was confused and groggy. What's going on?" She didn't answer. She started digging frantically through my blankets, throwing pillows aside, searching for the handset I had brought up with me. She was hysterical, tears streaming down her face, but she kept her voice at a bare whisper. "We need the phone," she cried softly. "Right now." We finally found the phone buried under the duvet. She snatched it from my hand. Her fingers were shaking so hard she could barely hit the buttons. She didn't call our parents. She dialed 3 numbers. 911. My stomach dropped. The weed haze evaporated instantly. "Why are you calling the police?" I whispered, finally catching her fear. She held the phone to her ear, her other hand gripping my arm so tight it hurt. "There is someone in the house," she whispered. I froze. I listened to the silence of the house. I couldn't hear anything. She gave our address to the operator, her voice cracking. She told them she heard an intruder downstairs. She told them to hurry. After she hung up, we didn't wait. We knew we had to wake up Mom and Dad before the police arrived with sirens wailing. We ran down the hall to our parents' bedroom. We shook them awake. My dad was confused, groggy, and trying to figure out why his daughters were crying in the dark. My mom sat up, terrified. "The police are coming," my sister said. "I heard someone. Someone is downstairs." My dad, being the protector, immediately wanted to go downstairs and check. My sister grabbed him and begged him not to go. She was absolutely certain that whoever was down there was dangerous. Then a new panic hit me. The weed. We had left our stash and a pipe on the coffee table in the den. If the police came in and searched the house, they would find the intruder, but they would also find our drugs. In my young, panicked mind, this felt like a disaster, but I couldn't go down there to hide it. If there really was a burglar, I would be walking right into them. I had to just pray the police wouldn't care about a little bit of pot while looking for a criminal. We heard the sirens in the distance getting louder. Then we saw the flashing blue and red lights reflect off the snow outside and dance across the bedroom walls. The police had arrived. We stayed upstairs while the officers entered the house. We could hear their heavy boots on the hardwood floors. We heard the crackle of their radios. We heard them opening doors and checking closets. My dad went down to talk to them, while my mom, my sister, and I huddled together in the bedroom. My sister refused to leave the room. She was curled up in a ball, refusing to speak about what she had heard. After about 20 minutes, my dad came back upstairs. The police were with him. "They didn't find anyone," Dad said. He looked relieved, but also a little annoyed. The back door was unlocked, but there's no sign of forced entry. Nothing seems to be missing. They checked the basement, the garage, everywhere. It's clear. The police officers were nice about it. They said they would patrol the neighborhood, but the house was empty. They suggested that maybe the wind had blown a door open or an animal had made a noise. My sister wouldn't accept it. She shook her head violently. "I heard him," she whispered. "I know he was there." The police left. The house was quiet again, but the feeling of safety was gone. None of us wanted to go back to our own rooms. My sister was too terrified to be alone, and honestly, so was I. My dad decided he would stay awake for the rest of the night, sitting in the chair by the window, keeping watch. My mom, my sister, and I all climbed into my parents' big king-sized bed. We lay there in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. It was a long, sleepless night. Finally, the sun began to rise. The gray light of morning filled the room, and the terrors of the night began to feel a little bit silly, as they often do in the daylight. My dad had fallen asleep in the chair. We all woke up, stiff and tired. My sister looked embarrassed. She sat up and rubbed her face. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I must have freaked out over nothing. We were high. Maybe I just imagined it. I feel so stupid for calling the police." "It's okay," I told her, though I was secretly relieved she was admitting it. Better safe than sorry. We all got up and went downstairs to start the day. The house looked normal. The Christmas tree was still there. The TV was off. The sun was shining on the snow outside. It felt like a regular morning. My sister walked into the kitchen ahead of me. I was right behind her, thinking about making a strong pot of coffee. Suddenly, she stopped dead in her tracks. She stopped so fast I almost bumped into her. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at the kitchen counter. "What?" I asked, stepping around her. Then I saw her face. All the color had drained out of it. She looked ashen, paler than she had been the night before. Her eyes were locked on the counter. She started backing away, slowly shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no. What the hell happened last night?" I practically screamed at her, scared by her reaction. "Tell me right now." She pointed a shaking finger at the counter. "I was in the den," she stammered, her voice trembling. "The den is right next to the kitchen. I heard rustling. It was loud. It sounded like the plastic wrap being moved around. It went on for 10 minutes. I sat there, frozen, listening to someone in the kitchen. I finally got up the nerve to run past the kitchen to the stairs to get to you." I looked at where she was pointing. I looked at the plate of fudge. When we had left it the night before, we had carefully smoothed the plastic wrap down. It had been perfect. Now the plastic wrap was torn back. It was crinkled and messy, tossed to the side. And the fudge. There was a huge piece missing. It wasn't a mouse. A mouse would have left tiny nibble marks or droppings. A mouse would have gnawed at the corner. This was different. A massive, jagged chunk of the fudge had been broken off. It looked like someone had reached in with a large hand and grabbed a fistful of it. It was a human-sized portion. We stared at the plate in horror. My dad came into the kitchen behind us. He saw us staring. He looked at the fudge. He tried to rationalize it immediately. "It must have been a mouse," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Or a raccoon. Something got in." "There are no teeth marks, Dad," I said, my voice shaking. "And we didn't see any droppings. And the plastic. Look at the plastic." My sister started crying again. This time, it wasn't hysteria. It was a deep, quiet dread. She realized how close she had been. She had been sitting on the couch in the next room, just a few feet away, through an open archway. For 10 minutes, she had listened to a stranger standing in our kitchen, in the dark, eating my mother's fudge. If she had walked into the kitchen, instead of running to the stairs. If she had called out. We never found out who it was. The police report was filed as a false alarm. Nothing else was stolen. The weed was still on the table in the den, thankfully. But the feeling of violation lasted for a long time. My father swore up and down for years that it had to be a rodent. He checked the walls for holes, he set traps. He caught nothing. He just couldn't admit that someone had been in the house with his family while he slept. It took a long time before we could talk about it normally. It took years before my sister could joke about the fudge monster with the rest of us. But even now, when we tell the story and laugh about the mysterious intruder with a sweet tooth, there is a moment where the laughter dies down. We look at each other and we remember the missing chunk of chocolate, the crinkled plastic, and the terrifying realization that we were not alone in the house that night. John was rapidly approaching his 40th birthday, and there was a quiet, nagging voice in the back of his mind that would not leave him alone. It whispered to him late at night and during the quiet moments of his morning commute. It told him that he was not the same man he used to be. When he was 20 years old, he had felt completely unstoppable. He had been quick-minded, physically strong, and entirely fearless. He had energy that seemed to burn like an endless fire. But now, nearly 2 decades later, things were different. He caught himself getting tired much faster than before. His thoughts felt a little slower, a little foggier. He found himself worrying about things that never would have crossed his mind in his youth. He did not like this feeling at all. In fact, he hated it. He wanted to prove to himself that he still had that same fire inside him. He wanted to know that he still possessed the sharp edge and the raw survival instincts he had always been so proud of. So, after weeks of thinking about it and planning every detail in his head, he decided to do something about it. He packed a small, efficient survival kit. He included a detailed topographic map, a high-quality compass, a sharp hunting knife, some basic camping gear, and a bag of dried food rations. He did not pack a tent or a heavy sleeping bag because he wanted to challenge himself. He loaded up his truck and drove far outside the city limits. He drove for hours, watching the buildings fade away and be replaced by fields and then by dense forests. He kept driving until he reached the deepest, thickest woods he could find on the map. This was a place where there were no rental cabins, no marked hiking trails, no family campers, and no fishing spots. It was nothing but trees and silence stretching out for miles in every direction. He wanted to disappear into nature for a full week, completely alone, just to see if he still had it in him to survive and thrive. On the first day, the adrenaline was pumping through his veins. He pushed himself harder than he probably should have. He parked his truck on the side of a gravel fire road and walked straight into the forest, leaving the faint path behind him almost immediately. He walked until the road was just a memory, and then he walked some more until the path vanished completely into the undergrowth. He did not want any signs of civilization around him. He wanted to carve out his own space in the wild. He wanted to build his own shelter from fallen branches and live off the land like he had always imagined doing when he was a young, dreamy boy reading adventure novels. The morning passed quickly, and the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky. By late afternoon, he decided he needed to set up a rabbit snare before nightfall if he wanted to eat fresh meat. He began wandering around, looking for a good spot to set his trap. He kept his eyes on the ground, searching for small tracks, droppings, or signs of wildlife trails. He was so focused on the ground that he didn't realize how far he had drifted or how much he had turned. The deeper he walked, the less familiar everything looked. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their branches weaving a thick net that blocked out the sky. He stopped and looked around. He turned in a slow circle, expecting to see a landmark he recognized, perhaps a distinct rock or a crooked tree he had passed earlier, but he did not recognize a single thing. Every tree looked exactly the same as the one next to it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his compass, feeling a small spike of anxiety in his chest. He looked down at the dial, but the needle was floating lazily, not pointing firmly in the direction he expected. He tapped the glass, but it didn't help. He looked up at the sky to check the sun's position, but heavy gray clouds had rolled in silently and swallowed the sun completely. The light was flat and gray, making it impossible to tell east from west. Slowly, the uneasy feeling crept in. It started in his stomach and worked its way up to his throat. He was lost. He took a deep breath and tried to calm himself. He told himself not to panic. Panic was the enemy of survival. He told himself that he still had hours of daylight left and that he just needed to think logically. But soon he realized he was wrong about the time. The clouds were not just passing through, they were a storm front. They rolled in with terrifying speed, turning the gray sky into a bruised purple and black. The whole forest darkened as if someone had dimmed a light switch. Within minutes, the wind changed direction. The temperature dropped rapidly, biting through his jacket. Then the sky opened up. Rain poured down in heavy, relentless sheets. It wasn't a gentle shower, it was a deluge. It soaked through his clothes in seconds, chilling him to the bone. The ground turned into a slurry of mud. His boots sank into the earth, with every step making walking a chore. His hands began to tremble from the sudden cold. He knew with a sudden, sharp clarity that he was in trouble. He needed shelter immediately, or he was going to risk hypothermia. He started searching frantically for a place to sleep. He looked for a large fallen tree he could crawl under, or a cluster of thick bushes he could weave into a windbreak. He looked for a cave or an overhang, but the woods were not kind that evening. The rain grew heavier, blurring his vision. The ground grew slick and treacherous. The shadows thickened as the last bit of daylight drained away, leaving him stumbling in the near darkness. Then, through the trees, he saw something far in the distance. It was just a shape at first, barely visible through the downpour. It was a structure, a crooked, jagged outline standing against the darkness of the trees. It was a shack. He blinked the rain out of his eyes and wiped his face with a wet sleeve, staring hard. Yes, it was definitely a shack. It looked old. It was rotting and leaning to one side, looking like a strong wind might blow it over. But it was real. It was a man-made structure. He didn't know who had built it or why it was out here in the middle of nowhere, miles from any road. But at that moment, it felt like the best luck he had ever had in his life. He told himself he could survive anything if he just made it through the night. He could rough it out until morning. Once the rain stopped and the sun came up, he could find his bearings and find the path again. He pushed forward, his legs burning with effort. Branches scraped against his arms and mud splashed up to his knees. He slipped and stumbled, but he kept his eyes on the dark shape of the shack. By the time he finally reached it, the night had fully set in. It was so dark he couldn't even see the outline of the roof against the sky. His hands reached out blindly in front of him until they touched the rough, wet wood of the wall. It felt soft with rot, spongy and damp, as if the wood had been standing there decaying for 50 years. He felt his way along the wall until he found the door. He pushed it. It resisted for a moment, then swung open. It creaked loudly, a long, high-pitched groan that echoed through the quiet forest and made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He stepped into the doorway. Thick cobwebs brushed across his forehead and tangled in his wet hair. He reached up and pulled them off with a shiver of disgust. He stood there in the pitch black, cursing himself for leaving his heavy flashlight at home to save weight. Lighting that flashlight right now would have felt like lighting a beacon of hope. Instead, he dug into his damp pocket and found a small cardboard box of matches. He tried to keep his hand steady as he pulled one out. He struck it against the side of the box. It hissed, sparked, and then glowed weakly. The small flame gave off a dim orange light that barely pushed back the darkness. The light danced across the walls, casting long, jumping shadows. He stepped fully inside and closed the door behind him to shut out the wind. The shack smelled old, really old. It smelled like wet wood, black mold, stale dust, and something else he couldn't quite name. It was a musk, like an animal den or something that had been abandoned for a century. The floorboards creaked and groaned under his heavy boots. He held the match up higher, trying to see where he was. The flickering light revealed something he didn't expect. The walls were covered in paintings. There were dozens of them. They were not beautiful landscapes of the forest or happy portraits of a family. They were not simple sketches or abstract art. They were faces, they were human faces, painted in dark, heavy strokes. Some of the faces were twisted in absolute pain, their mouths opened wide in silent, eternal screams. Some had hollow, sunken eyes that looked full of fear and despair. Others had angry, hateful expressions, their brows furrowed and their lips curled back in snarls as if they resented anyone who dared to enter the room. Their eyes seemed to follow him. At least, in the flickering light, it felt like they did. Some of the faces were pointing directly at him, their painted fingers stretched out as if they were warning him to leave or accusing him of some unknown crime. The match flickered again as a draft came through the walls. The shadows stretched and twisted, making every face look like it was moving, shifting, and breathing. He swallowed hard and stared, his heart pounding against his ribs. He didn't know who had painted them. He didn't know why someone would take the time to fill a small, rotting shack in the middle of the deep woods with such terrifying images. Every instinct in his body screamed that this place was wrong. It felt evil. He tried to ignore the feeling. He was a rational man. He told himself that shadows play tricks on tired minds. The rain and the cold were making him nervous. Fear was making everything look worse than it really was. It was just art, he told himself. Just creepy art left by some hermit years ago. He was exhausted. He was freezing cold. He needed sleep more than he needed to be comfortable with the decor. The match burned down to his fingers, stinging his skin. He blew it out and let the darkness settle around him like a heavy blanket. A part of him felt a massive wave of relief the moment the paintings disappeared from his sight. He didn't want to look at those hateful eyes anymore. But another part of him felt worse. Now that it was dark, he couldn't see them at all. He could only imagine them. He could only picture them hanging there in the dark, staring at him. He fumbled around in the dark until he found a musty old bed frame along the far wall. The mattress sagged in the middle and smelled of mildew. The blanket bunched on top of it was damp, but it was better than sleeping on the floor. He lay down, curled his knees up to his chest to preserve body heat, and tried to force himself to sleep. He couldn't do it. Thunder boomed outside, shaking the ground. The wind rattled the rotting boards, making the whole shack groan. Water dripped rhythmically from a hole in the roof somewhere in the corner, a steady drip, drip, drip that sounded like a ticking clock. He kept thinking about the faces, the screaming ones, the pointing ones, the way the shadows seemed to crawl toward him when the match was lit. His heart beat too fast to relax. His skin prickled with goosebumps that had nothing to do with the cold. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined those faces pressed right up against his own face, screaming silently into his ears. He finally drifted in and out of a restless, shallow sleep. He woke up every time the thunder cracked loudly, or whenever he thought he heard something move inside the shack. At one point deep in the night, he felt like someone was standing right near the bed, breathing shallowly. He froze, listening, his eyes squeezed shut. But when he opened his eyes, there was nothing there, just the impenetrable darkness. He told himself it was just the wind. Morning came slowly. It didn't arrive with a burst of sunlight, but rather with a thin, gray light that began seeping into the shack, turning the blackness into a murky gray. John's eyes opened. The first thing he saw was the ceiling above him, rotted, water-stained wood with gaps where the sky peeked through. He sat up quietly, rubbing his arms vigorously to get the blood flowing. His breath was visible in the cold morning air, puffing out in small white clouds. He felt heavy, stiff, and deeply uneasy. Then he remembered the paintings. He turned his head quickly, wanting to get it over with. He wanted to see them in the clear daylight so he could convince himself they weren't as terrifying as he remembered. He wanted to laugh at his own fear. But when he turned to look at the wall, he froze. There were no paintings, not a single one. The walls were completely empty. The wood was bare, stained only by water and age. John's heart gave a massive, painful thud in his chest. He frowned, confused. He thought maybe he had looked at the wrong wall. He turned his head to the other side. Nothing. He stood up and turned around fully, scanning the entire room. The shack was small. There was nowhere for them to hide. The walls were bare. He stepped closer, scanning every inch of the wood. No paintings, no frames, no nail holes where frames used to hang, no square outlines where dust had collected around a canvas. There was absolutely no sign that anything had ever hung on those walls. Instead, the walls were lined with windows. They were long, narrow, dusty windows. He stood there, his mind racing, trying to put the pieces together. In the dim, flickering light of his single match the night before, he had mistaken the rectangular shapes for paintings. It was an easy mistake to make in the dark, but now, as the gray morning light filtered through the glass, he realized something far more unsettling, something that made his blood run cold. The faces he thought he saw weren't painted on canvas. They were reflections. Or worse, they weren't reflections at all. He looked at the windows again. They were grimy and covered in years of dirt. But last night, it had been pitch black inside the shack and pitch black outside. If he had been looking at a reflection of himself, he would have seen one face moving when he moved. But he had seen dozens. He had seen faces that were screaming, faces that were hating, faces that were old and young. That meant the faces weren't inside the room with him. They were shapes in the glass. They were shadows moving outside. Something in the cold silence of the morning made his skin crawl violently. He looked at the angles of the windows. They were at head height. The glass was fogged from the inside, but streaks of rain had cleared parts of the outside. He stepped closer, trembling. He leaned in and wiped a small circle of condensation away with his fingertip to see clearly. Outside the window there was nothing, just the dense forest, the gray sky. The rain drips from the heavy branches of the pines. Absolute silence, but in the faint, foggy outline left on the glass where the condensation had been disturbed, he thought he could still see the shape of a face. A mouth opens wide, eyes wide and staring. He took a sharp step back, stumbling over his own boots. The room felt suddenly colder, freezing the air in his lungs. The impurity hit him like a physical blow. For him to see faces in the windows last night, while he held a match inside, there had to be something pressing against the glass from the outside. Something standing in the storm, watching him. Something that wanted to be seen. He didn't wait to investigate further. He didn't look for footprints in the mud outside. He grabbed his gear, shoving his blanket into his bag with shaking hands. He stumbled out of the shack into the damp morning air, his heart racing like a trapped bird. He didn't look back at the shack. He didn't stop walking. He didn't try to figure out where he had gone wrong with his compass or try to find his snare. He just moved. He walked fast, half running, crashing through the brush until the sun rose high enough that he could see the direction of the sun through the clouds. He used the sun to find east, and he walked until his legs burned. It took him hours to find the main trail again. When he finally reached the gravel road and saw his truck, he almost cried with relief. He drove home in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. When he finally reached civilization, he didn't tell anyone what happened. He didn't tell his wife. He didn't tell his friends. He didn't have the words to explain it, and he didn't want to admit how close he came to panicking or how deeply that shack had unsettled him. He didn't want to admit that the tough survivor he wanted to be was actually a disenchanted man running from a shack in the woods. But he never went back to that forest. He never camped alone again. And he never forgot the faces staring at him from the windows in the dark, watching him sleep. I was spending the night at my boyfriend's house, something I had done many times before. His parents were gone for the night, so the entire house was ours. It was usually a calm place, an ordinary home with quiet hallways, soft yellow lamps, and a sense of comfort that made me feel safe. The only other living thing in the house was the family cat, who always slept downstairs and usually stayed there until morning. The upstairs was silent, dark, and still. My boyfriend has never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. He always told me I let my imagination run wild too easily. Whenever I talked about something strange or creepy, he would laugh, pat my hand, and say, "Don't worry, it's all in your head." I used to joke that if a ghost walked right past him, he still wouldn't believe it. He was that kind of person. Logical, relaxed, and grounded. That night, though, something happened that shook me in a way I still think about sometimes. We were sleeping in his room, already a few hours into the night. The room was dark except for the soft glow coming from the streetlight outside. His curtains were thin, so faint light always spilled through, painting dim shapes on the walls. The space felt peaceful at first. I drifted off comfortably, wrapped in the quiet hum of the house. My boyfriend had a habit of sleep-talking sometimes. Usually it was nonsense. Random words, half sentences, or mumbling that made no sense. I had gotten used to it. But that night, what he did wasn't sleep-talking. It wasn't mumbling. It wasn't even half-awake confusion. He suddenly sat up straight in the bed. He moved quickly, like someone who heard a loud sound or sensed danger. The sudden motion jolted me awake. I opened my eyes, disoriented, and saw him sitting upright with his back stiff, his breathing a little heavier than normal. Then he said, in a fully awake voice, "Turn on the light. It's here watching us." His tone wasn't joke-like or sleepy or confused. It was calm and direct, the way he spoke when he was completely awake. I blinked a few times, trying to understand what he meant. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice groggy. I thought he might be dreaming, but he didn't look like someone dreaming. He didn't look confused. He looked alert. "You want me to turn on the light?" "Yes," he said. "Turn on the light. It's in the room watching us." Something cold slipped down my spine. It wasn't the words alone. It was the way he said them, slow, serious, like he meant every bit of it. I sat up slowly, trying to figure out if he was awake or asleep. His eyes were open. He was looking at the room around us. He wasn't blinking much, but he didn't seem lost or dazed. He looked like someone who had noticed something I hadn't. So I got out of bed. The room was dark, and the air felt heavy and strange. I walked to the light switch, my feet cold on the floor, and turned the light on. The room filled with warm, yellow brightness. Nothing looked unusual, just clothes, a desk, the curtains, the door, the shelves. He looked around the room, then let out a small sigh of relief. "Okay," he said quietly. "We're fine." I turned off the light again, confused, and got back into bed. The darkness returned, and the room went silent again. I could hear his breathing start to slow as he rolled over to his side. "You made it go away," he murmured, and before I could ask anything, he was asleep again. fully asleep, breathing evenly. I lay there staring at the ceiling, not sure what to think. My heart was beating too fast and the room suddenly felt too quiet. I tried to tell myself he must have been dreaming. Maybe something scared him while he was asleep and he woke up confused. But he had seemed so calm and sure, not like someone who didn't know where he was. I finally closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep. A little while later, something woke him up again. This time, he wasn't sitting up. He was lying on his back, but staring intensely at the wall beside me. The wall with the windowsill, and the faint reflection from the outside streetlight. His eyes looked wide and focused, not empty, not foggy. Awake. "Look at the windowsill," he whispered. "The shadow." I turned my head slowly and saw the soft reflection from the streetlight. It always hit that part of the wall in a stretched shape, like a dim patch of light. Nothing unusual, just a reflection you barely noticed most nights. He pointed at it. "There," he said. "The ghost. It's sitting in the reflection." His voice didn't shake. He sounded like he was describing something perfectly normal, something obvious. He wasn't panicking, he wasn't screaming, he was calm, which somehow made it much more frightening. I swallowed hard. "You need to wake up," I told him. "Stop being weird." But he didn't blink. His eyes stayed locked on that patch of light. "Move it away," he said. "What?" "Move what?" He repeated it. "Move it away. The ghost is sitting on the windowsill. You just have to move it." I stared at him. I didn't know if he was awake or dreaming or something in between. He reached across me, stretching over my body since I was the one sleeping closest to the wall, and grabbed my hand. He lifted my hand gently and guided it toward the patch of light on the wall. Then he made me do a wiping motion, like wiping steam off a window or brushing dust off a surface. My hand moved back and forth across the wall, following his pressure. As I did it, I saw the reflection shift slightly. Maybe it was just the angle of my hand blocking a little of the light. Maybe it was my eyes adjusting because I had just woken up. Maybe I imagined it. But in that moment, it felt like something moved out of the reflection. He looked at the wall for a moment, then nodded. "See," he whispered, "it's gone now. You made it go away." Then he turned onto his side, pulled the blanket up over his shoulder, and fell asleep instantly. Not slowly, not gradually, instantly, just like someone who had never been awake at all. I lay there for a long time, completely frozen, staring at the wall, staring at the reflection, staring at the windowsill. I listened to his breathing, listened to the quiet house, listened for the slightest noise that might tell me I wasn't alone. That night, every little sound felt louder. The ticking of the clock, the faint movement of the house settling, even the soft buzz of electricity in the walls felt wrong. I didn't sleep for hours. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something standing in the corner, watching us, like he said. Eventually, morning came and light filled the room. He woke up cheerful, stretching and yawning like he had slept the entire night without interruption. I asked him cautiously, "Do you remember anything you said last night?" He blinked at me. "What?" "No, why?" "You woke up twice," I told him quietly. "Saying something was watching us. You said there was a ghost. You made me move it away." He frowned, confused. "I didn't do that. I must have been talking in my sleep." But his voice the night before, it hadn't sounded like sleep talking. It had sounded real, solid, intentional. He had acted awake, not confused, not groggy, awake. I tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't. Something about the whole experience felt wrong. The calmness in his voice, the way he acted so certain, the way he guided my hand, the way he fell asleep again immediately afterward. It didn't fit his personality at all. He wasn't the type to get scared by shadows. He wasn't the type to imagine ghosts. He didn't believe in any of it. I didn't tell him how scared I really was. But for the next few nights, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that same patch of light on the wall and something sitting in it, watching. I replayed his voice over and over again in my head, saying, "It's here watching us." Even now, I don't know what happened that night. Maybe he was dreaming. Maybe I was half asleep and saw the light move in a way that felt unnatural. Maybe we were both tired and our minds played tricks on us. But deep inside, a part of me still remembers the exact tone of his voice. Calm, certain, awake. And the way he looked around the room like he wasn't seeing what I was seeing. And that part of me can't shake the feeling that something else was there with us. Something. If these stories feel familiar, there's a reason. Most people have experienced something they don't talk about. If you're still listening, leave a like and subscribe. It helps keep stories like these alive. And if something has ever followed you home, send it in. Let's continue. When I was 8 years old, my family lived in a house that never really felt normal. Even now, when I think back on it, the word that comes to mind is strange. It was big, older, and sat right on the edge of a small town, far enough away that it felt isolated, but still close enough that you could see other houses in the distance. It wasn't the kind of place that felt warm or comforting. It had long hallways, odd corners, and rooms that always felt darker than they should have, even during the day. At that time, the local school district was going through a major restructuring. Boundaries were changing, schools were being reassigned, and nothing was very consistent. Because of this, even though my brother and I were only a couple of grades apart, we ended up going to different schools. That also meant we took different buses, with different schedules. My brother's bus came later in the morning and dropped him off later in the afternoon. Mine came earlier both ways. Because of that, I was the last person to leave the house every morning and the first person to come home every afternoon. That responsibility fell on me simply because of timing, even though I was just a kid. My parents made it clear that since I was the last one out, it was my job to make sure the house was locked up. Every morning before leaving, I had to walk through the house, turn off lights, check doors, and lock the front door behind me. It made me feel grown up at first, like I had an important job. But it also meant I spent a lot of time alone in that house, and that feeling slowly became uncomfortable. One morning, while doing my usual routine, I noticed something odd. The basement door was open and the light inside the basement was on. This immediately stood out to me because no one ever went into the basement in the mornings. The basement wasn't a place we used often. It was unfinished, dark, and mostly used for storage. I remember pausing for a moment at the top of the stairs, feeling uneasy, but telling myself there was a logical explanation. I went down just enough to reach the light switch, turned it off, and closed the basement door. I didn't think much more about it after that. I locked the front door and left for school. That afternoon, when my bus dropped me off and I walked back into the house, the first thing I noticed was the same thing I had seen that morning. The basement door was open again, and the light was on. At first, I brushed it off. I assumed I must have been mistaken earlier. Maybe I hadn't really turned the light off. Maybe I hadn't fully closed the door. I was 8 years old, after all, and it was easy to believe I had simply forgotten. So I walked over to the basement door again, intending to do the same thing I had done that morning. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down. That was when I saw it. At the bottom of the staircase, standing in the shadows, was a large male figure. I couldn't make out details like facial features or clothing. It was mostly a dark shape, but it was clearly human, tall, broad, solid. It wasn't something my imagination could easily explain away as a trick of the light. The moment felt frozen. My brain couldn't fully process what my eyes were seeing. Then fear hit me all at once. I slammed the basement door shut as hard as I could. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the handle. I dragged boxes, storage bins, anything I could find, and shoved them against the door to block it. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was acting purely on instinct. After that, I ran. I ran to my bedroom and hid in my closet, curling up as small as I could. I stayed there for hours, barely breathing, convinced that if I made a sound, something terrible would happen. Every noise in the house made my heart pound. The sound of the walls settling, the hum of appliances, even distant traffic felt like footsteps coming closer. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. For months, I kept it to myself. I was absolutely certain that what I had seen was a ghost. That was the only explanation my 8-year-old mind could come up with. And I was just as certain that no one would believe me. I didn't want to be laughed at or told I was imagining things, so I stayed quiet. Life went on, but I was never comfortable in that house again. I rushed through my morning routines. I hated being alone there. I avoided the basement completely. Even walking past the door made my stomach twist. Still, I never said a word. About a year later, strange things started happening. My mom and her boyfriend began to notice that small amounts of money were going missing. At first, they thought it was simple forgetfulness. A few dollars misplaced here and there didn't seem like a big deal. But as time went on, the pattern became harder to ignore. The amounts were always small, never more than $60 at a time. But it kept happening. Over several months, it added up to somewhere between $800 and $900. That was a lot of money for our family. They searched the house, trying to figure out how it could be happening. No doors were broken. No windows showed signs of forced entry. Nothing else was disturbed. Just the money. One evening, they decided to do a full inspection of the house. We all grabbed flashlights and started looking everywhere. Closets, attics, under furniture, behind storage boxes. Eventually, someone checked the outside of the house more carefully. That's when they found it. There was a small hole on the exterior of the house, partially hidden and easy to miss. It led into a crawl space beneath the house. From there, someone could squeeze through, move through the crawl space, and then access the basement from inside. That was how he was getting in. Some stranger had been climbing into our house, crawling through tight spaces and coming up through the basement. He had been living off our money, taking small amounts at a time, so it wouldn't be noticed right away. When my mom and her boyfriend realized this, the truth hit me all at once. What I had seen that day wasn't a ghost. It was him. The shadowy figure at the bottom of the basement stairs was a real person. A man who had been inside our house without us knowing. A man who had been watching, waiting, and stealing. The realization made me feel sick. I finally told my family what I had seen a year earlier. As I spoke, I could see the horror spread across their faces. They understood immediately what it meant. I had been alone in the house with him, at least once, possibly more times than that. That moment was one of the most terrifying of my life. Even more than the day I had slammed the basement door shut. The fear wasn't imagined anymore. It was real. It had a face, even if I never saw it clearly. We contacted the authorities. The hole was sealed. The house was secured. But the damage had already been done. The sense of safety was gone. Even now, years later, I still think about that house. About being 8 years old and standing at the top of those basement stairs. About how close I came to something far worse than I ever understood at the time. What scares me most isn't the memory of the shadow. It's the realization of how vulnerable I was and how easily something terrible could have happened without anyone knowing. I live in a stretch of Kentucky that feels like the earth remembers older rules. The roads narrow and curl like old scars. The trees grow close enough to hush a conversation. On the map, there was a thick cluster of red dots right in my county. They sat on top of a small, neglected cavern system called the Blackwood Sinkholes. It wasn't some glossy tourist cave with electric walkways and an Instagram account. It was a jagged wound in the woods, a place the locals avoided without agreeing to explain why. I showed the map to Jess because she'd laugh at me if I kept staring at it alone. Jess is the kind of woman who owns multiple kinds of hiking boots, who names trails like old friends and eats protein bars like relics. I am not that person. I read unsolved cases until my eyes go gritty and spend Sundays in the kind of pajamas that declare bankruptcy in the fashion world. It lines up, I said, pointing at the screen. Look, people keep vanishing where the sinkholes are. Maybe they fall, maybe they get lost, or maybe something down there wants people. She rolled her eyes the way you roll your eyes at a campfire ghost story, but her smile said she was in. You want to go ghost hunting, or are you going to try to prove everyone wrong? Debunking, I said, because I like the sound of being rational in the face of nonsense. We packed the Jeep Friday, tents, sleeping bags, a pile of firewood, 2 folding chairs, and a cooler full of ribs I'd marinated for 48 hours. I insisted on real bourbon because cheap whiskey makes you poetic, and we needed the sort of courage that goes with butchering a bottle. The hike-in was worse than either of us expected. The trail dropped away from the logging road into a clotted green that grabbed your ankles and tried to keep you. The trees here grew with bent purpose, roots exposed like old hands. When we found the cave mouth, it looked almost human, an open mouth carved in limestone, dark and patient. Cold air spilled out of the hole like breath too old to be warm. It smelled like wet stone and something metallic under it. Copper or old coins. We set up camp 50 yards from the entrance because you don't put a tent right next to an open, dark thing unless you like obsolete decisions. We built the fire and set the grill over it, and the smoke rolled low across the ground. The ribs stuck to the grate gloriously, the sauce bubbling and caramelizing. For a while, we ate like people who trusted that the rest of the world would keep going whether we stayed or left. Jess laughed about a guy who tripped over his own marshmallow stick. I nodded, and the laugh in my chest felt real. Then the woods stopped being noisy. The insects fell silent. The wind folded. When things get very quiet in nature, it doesn't mean calm. It means attention. The silence pressed in like a hand over our mouths. I remember Jess going still and saying, "Do you hear that?" As if the question itself might break whatever was listening. The cave made a sound then, deep and long, a moan that could be written off as wind if you were on a hiking blog and trying to sound brave. It wasn't wind. It was the cave itself, inhaling and exhaling, like lungs that had been closed for a long time and were tired of staying that way. Something scraped inside like grit under a tongue. Then the sound became retching, deep, wet, the sort of coughing that suggests something is trying to drag itself back up from the dark. It warped into a whispering voice. "Come," it said, but it wasn't a clear invitation. It was a grinding of stones together in a rhythm that your brain wanted to turn into syllables. Jess grabbed the grill lid like a shield. "We leave," she said. Her voice wasn't shaky. We both sound better in command when the world is falling apart. I grabbed the hatchet I'd used for splitting wood because there are pieces of metal, however small, that make you feel like someone expects you to be dangerous. The smell hit us before we could see them. Old meat and sweet rot, a stink that draped itself over your shoulders and sat there like an accusation. Then shapes untangled from the cave. They were wrong in the way of nightmares that have studied you and learned your favorite ways to panic. Imagine the outline of a person stretched too far, joints angling where joints shouldn't, a limb bending like bad wiring. Their skin was sallow, silvered with old lotion, but it glistened with wetness like grease. Their faces were too long, mouths pulled back into grins that might be teeth or might be something they've sewn on with confidence. Their eyes were cloudy as if someone had painted them over. 3 of them crawled out at first. 2 slid on all fours with too many elbows. The 3rd limped forward with a movement like an insect unlearning how to walk. They went straight for the grill like they'd been invited to a banquet. One of them grabbed the searing metal with a hand that looked like a child's channeling an old witch. Flesh shriveled and popped against the grate, and it didn't scream. It licked the grease with a tongue that was blackened and long. The thing made a sound part chitter, part purr, the universe misreading pleasure. They weren't hunting us, they were feeding. They even seemed to savor it, which is worse. Predators that savor you are the ones who remember you. I yanked the trash bag of bones at instinct, because we carry gross things into the woods, and sometimes that's the price of being alive. The bag slapped one of them and burst. Ribs and paper towels scattered across the dirt. The creature dove, not toward us now, but into the ribs, teeth closing like the tap of nutcracker. The sound of bone breaking, sharp, brittle, was obscene under the quiet. That pause was the moment the world decided I wasn't a character in a clean ghost story. We ran because running is a human thing, bad at first but then automatic. The woods closed a million hands on us. Roots, low, branches, thorny vines, my shirt tore, Jess's leggings snagged. We fell down, got up, and fell again. A choreography of panic. Behind us, the things were fast. Their movement wasn't bound by the steps we know. They didn't crunch through leaves so much as slide over them like an idea. Their emission of noise changed as they closed distance. First, a shriek that sounded like something being unstitched. Then a keening that borrowed the cadence of a child wail and rewired it into hatred. One hit the rear of the Jeep with a force that made glass tremble. It dented like an animal marking territory. We slammed the locks, and the world took a breath of time where our hearts tried to jump out through our ribs. On the way back to town, the radio made static like a face trying to talk. We agreed on a story, cougar, bear, weird raccoon, and told friends we just got spooked. We were lying to everyone except ourselves, because I kept going back to the map. The dots clustered at holidays. Holidays where people left their houses, lit fires, burned meat over open flames. The sinkholes weren't accidents. They were vents. They were mouths. They were receivers. After a few days, I started to notice things at the edges of myself. A fondness for the smell of charred meat I hadn't had before. My dreams thick with low groaning, a memory of the black tongue near my face. I couldn't say if it was fear making me notice or if it was something else grooming me to notice. The town had missing person reports that went back decades, the sort of papers that gather like cobwebs until the web stops being a metaphor and starts being a thing. The first time I went back to the sinkholes, I thought I'd finally be clever enough to prove it wrong. I took better gear. I took light that could blind a small god. I took rope, packs, an anchor, and a voice recorder, because modern bravado keeps receipts. I wanted to map the place, find the ventilation shafts they talk about in engineering textbooks where wind goes down and fresher air pulls up. Instead, I found little things that suggested the creatures fed in a system human eyes had never built for them. Soot that wasn't from any human fire. Small tubes of waxy substance anchored to rock like combs, and bone fragments too worn to be from the diet of any forest scavenger. On the third visit, I found a footprint. It wasn't quite a print, and it wasn't quite nothing. The ground around the sinkhole had a ring worn deep as a bowl. There were scrape marks that suggested something with too many knuckles had dug, like a fisherman learning to dig for bait. But there were also other marks, patterns, almost glyphs traced into stone, as if Someone had tried to scratch phrases into the world. Some of them were spiral loops. Others looked like parabolas. I pressed my gloved fingertips to one, because people do stupid tactile things to a place that feels dangerous, and a cold little shock ran up my arm like an apology. The marks were older than rust, older than our concept of old. You could write a theory that the sinkholes connected to caverns far below, spaces where sunlight is an invention people make up when daylight is missing too long. The idea that a colony of something adapted to living between drafts and stone would learn to attune itself to the smoke and smell of cooking human flesh is nothing short of efficient. Humans make a lot of meat and we put our fires out in the evening. We are, in a way, the alarm that tells the creatures to come. But lore needs more than logic to be terrifying. It needs a face. It needs rules. So I kept looking because I want to know how to avoid being an idiot again. The rules revealed themselves slowly, like frost. The creatures emerged when smoke bent toward the vents. They could sense 100 different molecules in air: burnt sugar, saturated oil, charcoal smoke, even the microscopic salts of human sweat. They weren't interested in you if you were raw and running. They were interested in the dressing, sauce and smoke and the sound of slow cooking. Holidays meant grills. Grills meant ribs. Ribs meant bones. Bones meant something to crunch on. They didn't run toward light. They ran toward smell. They lured sometimes with a cracked whisper that sounded like syllables arranged by a person learning to mimic the shape of human speech. Sometimes the voice came wrapped in a storm of static and a melody so small your ears tried to refuse it. Once I heard it, late one night at my kitchen table, there was a cadence I couldn't shake. It slid into a sentence like grease into a pan. Come feed us. You can be civilized and want explanation. That doesn't mean you're safe. One night I crafted the kind of foolish plan a man tells himself is research. I took a brisket heavy with rub and attached a recorder to it like a farmer making a trap. I filled a thermos with embers, hidden in meat smell and heat, and set it down just off the trail. I concealed myself 60 yards away with a camera. At 2:14 a.m., the camera caught motion. I watched the footage and made the slow growl of the first thing I saw, an audible thing in my bones. The thing that came for the meat didn't move as an animal, but as a suggestion of an animal. It had an elongated neck that bent like an old antenna. Its hands were wrong, more instruments than limbs. It bit the meat once and there was no sound of pain or warmth. Bones crumpled under teeth which looked like a child's idea of teeth. Too many, too small, all used. After it fed, it turned and looked almost at the camera. For a long second, the camera recorded something like recognition. Then it placed its palm flat against the lens. The screen registered oil and 5 black streaks shaped like the shadow of a hand. The video was corrupted in the spots where the palm pressed. The file refused to play the frames cleanly. You could see movement, then nothing, then movement again. As if whatever touched the camera took with it a small piece of time. I took that file to people I trusted. An engineer said atmospheric interference and sensors and cheap plastic lenses. But his voice had the tired quality of a man who will never again believe in a simple answer. The more I talked about it, the more people slid away until the only one who came back to the sinkholes was Jess. We thought ourselves prepared the night we brought a smoker, turned it into a deliberate banquet, and left it as bait. We put marks in the trees to show our route. We put reflective banding. I wrote each other's names on our arms with ink because some stories are cowardly rituals in their own right. We did everything you do when you try to simulate bravery. The smoker smoked. The smell threaded the woods like a ribbon and the air changed, like a throat clearing. We sat hunkered down in our backs against a hollowed-out log, breath loud enough to be a drum. When they came this time, it wasn't in a crawl. They arrived in a wave that made my bones clench. This time there were more of them than before, and they behaved with a sort of organized hunger. They didn't simply dive into the meat. They tore, they picked. They tore the skin of the meat from fissures, and then they did something worse. They began to feed on the fat and the muscle with a kind of ecclesiastical reverence, their heads bowing in ways that were both prayer and ritual. One of them took a bone and scraped the marrow out, lining its fingers with it, then pressed that marrow onto the stone like an offering. Another reached up at the tongue of smoke, like tasting it. The sound they made as they ate was a layered thing. Crunch and slurp and a whispered melody threaded through it like liturgy. When they weren't eating, they clicked their tongues together in a pattern that had cadence and emphasis, as if they were counting. Their skin had turned gray with ash in places where meat had spat grease, and their eyes reflected the fire like black marbles. In the smoke, I saw them make a slow circle, a motion that felt like counting off souls. They noticed Jess. They noticed me. Not immediately, they smelled us, and then arranged a shape in the dark that pointed their faces our way. One cocked its head, and there was that mimicry again, a partial syllable that sounded like boy or come or whatever your brain wanted to hear. Jess whispered, "Move," and I moved, because that's what you do when the thing in the dark has learned the sound of your voice. We ran. As we broke from the log, it felt different from previous flights. The creatures didn't chase the way animals chase. They pursued with a still, patient inevitability. At one point, something slammed into Jess's shoulder and tore the jacket fabric straight through her skin. I felt the weight of her, and I felt a cold under my ribs where the breath can no longer hold up a life. She didn't scream. Blood came out like motor oil and more like a mapping of weakness. The smell of iron in the air slapped me stupid. She fell between two roots, and the thing bent over her with too much tenderness. It smelled her like a connoisseur. It lifted her face, and I saw at once that what it wanted wasn't just flesh for chewing. It wanted the sounds that flex from a living throat. It pressed its ruined mouth to her ear, and there was a wet sound like words being rearranged in someone else's mouth. I am only brave for a second. I am only brave until the thing is by her face, and the world is narrow and hard, and focused on the wet music beside me. I grabbed at it. I stabbed with the hatchet. The head split like rotten fruit. Blood, thicker and darker than human blood, spattered my gloves and my face. The thing lurched, and a high keening rose up, a note so thin it cut my lungs. It wasn't animal pain, but a rupture of something cosmic. The creature convulsed, and its insides gave up a smell that explained everything and nothing. Sweetness gone wrong, the odor of ancient kitchens where dinner was offered to gods. The thing dropped Jess like leftover meat. She took a breath, and then another, and then her hand closed on mine, and she looked at me with eyes that tried and failed to be the same. She whispered, "Don't stop," in a voice that was not afraid. We left the smoker behind. We drove until the Jeep's engine sounded like a thing willing to carry guilt. We reached the town and told the story again and again, a loop you tightened to keep the truth from spilling. People asked questions. Police filed reports. Someone burned the smoking corpses later with torches until there were only bones and ash and a small black residue that would not wash from our hands. In the weeks that followed, I realized something miserable and private. I could smell the memory. Every time I passed a tailgate or a neighborhood grill, my brain found the hint of charcoal in the air and remembered the low groan of the cave. I would wake with a taste like burnt sugar in my mouth. Lore builds on bones like vines on old stone. People came to the sinkholes less when the stories started to spread. But curiosity never dies. It only becomes gorgeous in a new way. There were always people who considered danger a badge. There's something about knowledge of a thing existing that makes us think we own it. Like naming a thing means you control it. We don't. We name because naming is the human way to take inventory before we are taken. There are rules, though. They are not moral. They are mechanical. They enchant, then enforce. They like smoke, especially the kind that carries the scent of butter and sugar and char. They sense salt, sweat, and the tang of iron. They will come when you are cooking, loud and proud, because we make ourselves delicious in ways they have taught their bodies to need. If you find a sinkhole, you do not barbecue. If you must be near one, keep your fires wet, keep your smoke short, bring bells or other small clashing things that break a melody. The creatures hate dissonance. They like rhythm and easy songs. They hate the cracked ring of metal. That last piece of advice is practical and small, and it will not save you if the thing has already learned the sound of you. My hope is selfish. I want the map to be a map to nothing for everyone else. I want to walk past the sinkholes in a life that keeps its distance. But I know maps are bad at telling people to stay home. They whisper directions, they give waypoints, they help you get closer. If you go, take earplugs for the mimicry, leave the sauce at home, and resist the urge to think yourself the exception. Some nights I listen to the clip from the camera, and I freeze on the frame where the thing's hand touches the lens. I play the recording of the hatchet and the following shriek, and I can still taste blackened sugar at the back of my throat. Once you see them up close, you can't unknow the hunger in the way they honor what they eat. They are a religion formed from the underside of things we cook. Their rituals are built from bones and smoke. The sinkholes are not simple wounds in the earth. They are mouths, waiting patiently to be fed. Holidays are the worst time. The map shows red spreads like a rash because on those days the country takes to the fields and the lawns to gild the air with the scents these things adore. When the lights go out tonight and the grills flare up in rows, when someone lets the ribs caramelize to black and passes the plate around with pride, remember the map, the sinkholes, the way the dark listens. Remember the sound that tastes like weather. Come. Remember that the world sometimes opens not to swallow you, but to be made full. Remember that we carry our own invitations, wrapped in foil and sauce and bone, and that once you cook your way into their mouths, you might never find your way back out. Before my father died, he told me a story he had never shared openly during his life. He spoke about it only once, quietly, near the end, in a way that made it clear he was not exaggerating or trying to impress anyone. He was serious, calm, and almost careful with his words. This was something he had carried with him for decades. My father served in Vietnam in the 1960s. He was part of a small American unit that worked alongside local fighters known as CIDG strikers. These were South Vietnamese villagers who had been trained to fight, guide, and scout. They knew the jungle better than anyone, and American units depended on them heavily for deep missions away from bases and supply lines. The mission he told me about involved placing seismic ground sensors along a network of jungle trails. These sensors were designed to detect movement, especially large groups of enemy soldiers moving through the area. It was quiet work, slow and careful, and very dangerous. These missions often took days and involved moving deep into hostile territory with very little support. According to my father, the team consisted of 2 Americans and 5 CIDG strikers. They had already been in the jungle for about 2 days when this particular incident happened. By that point, they were tired, hungry, and constantly alert. The jungle never really let you relax. Even when nothing was happening, you were always listening, watching, waiting. On that day, the group reached a point where several narrow jungle trails crossed each other. It was the kind of place enemy units often used to move supplies or troops. The main group decided to continue placing sensors further away, but my father and two of the strikers split off to watch a nearby trail intersection for a while. The plan was simple: observe, listen, and decide whether it was safe to move farther down the trail or whether they should turn back and rejoin the others. They took up hidden positions in thick brush near the intersection. My father said the jungle felt unusually quiet that day. Not silent, but calm. There were birds calling, insects buzzing, and once in a while the sound of monkeys moving through the trees. No gunfire, no distant explosions, no signs of enemy movement, just the jungle being the jungle. They stayed there for several hours, maybe 3 or 4. Time moved strangely in those moments. Minutes felt long and hours blended together. They watched the trails carefully, scanning for movement, listening for footsteps or voices. Nothing happened. Eventually, they began to talk quietly among themselves, deciding what to do next. They agreed it might be best to move a little farther down the trail before heading back. Before stepping out of the cover of the brush, my father did what he always did. He checked the trail one last time. He looked carefully at the ground, the tree line, the shadows. He signaled to his men to get ready but to stay still until he gave the word. As he leaned forward and prepared to step onto the trail, something caught his eye. Lying along the edge of the trail, just short of the intersection, was a soldier. Not a Vietnamese soldier, not an American soldier. My father said his first thought was confusion. The man looked out of place in a way that was hard to explain. He was a light-skinned black man wearing what appeared to be an old-style military uniform. Not modern fatigues, not anything from the 1960s. The uniform looked like something from another era entirely. The soldier was fully equipped. He had 2 pistols, one on each side. He carried a Spencer rifle, the kind used during the American Civil War. At his hip was a short, curved club that my father immediately recognized as a Native American war club. For a moment, my father thought he must be hallucinating. Fatigue, stress, dehydration, those things could do strange things to the mind. But the soldier was too clear, too detailed. The gear was real. The posture was relaxed but alert, like someone who knew exactly where he was and why. Then the soldier turned his head and looked directly at my father. My father told me that what stayed with him most was the smile. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't strange. It was calm and familiar, almost reassuring. The soldier raised one finger and gently placed it to his lips, signaling for silence. Then he motioned with his hand, telling my father to move back into the jungle and away from the trail. My father didn't argue. He didn't question it. Training took over, but so did instinct. He slowly signaled to the 2 strikers to remain hidden. He eased himself back into the brush on his side of the trail, careful not to make a sound. As he moved, he noticed something that still gives me chills when I think about it. The soldier did the same thing on the opposite side of the trail. He slipped back into the jungle, mirroring my father's movement, as if they were part of the same unit, working together without a word spoken. Less than 10 seconds later, everything made sense. From the far end of the trail, enemy soldiers appeared. The lead element of a North Vietnamese army unit walked straight through the intersection. They were close, maybe 30 feet away. My father said they moved with discipline and confidence, weapons ready but not raised. More kept coming, dozens of them. He estimated there were at least 70, maybe 80 soldiers in total. They were heavily armed, automatic rifles, light machine guns, rocket-propelled grenade launchers. A force that large would have torn through my father's small team in seconds if they had stepped onto the trail. My father and the 2 strikers remained perfectly still. They didn't breathe louder than the jungle itself. The enemy soldiers passed through the intersection without ever knowing they had nearly walked into an ambush, or that they had nearly ambushed someone else. After what felt like forever, the last of the enemy soldiers disappeared down the trail. I, Father didn't see the Union soldier again. As soon as it was safe, my father and his men quietly pulled back and moved as fast as they could without making noise. They rejoined the rest of the patrol and reported the enemy movement they had observed. Command needed to know about a force that size moving through the area, but my father did not mention the soldier, not to his unit, not to his superiors, not to his friends. He kept that part to himself. He told me that in the military, especially during wartime, there were things you learned not to say out loud. Some experiences didn't fit into reports or after-action briefings. Some things, if spoken, would only bring questions you couldn't answer. He carried that secret for many years. The only person he told before me was his grandmother. He told her in the 1970s when she was on her deathbed. He described the soldier exactly as he had seen him, the uniform, the weapons, the smile. According to my father, his grandmother smiled softly when he finished. She didn't open her eyes. She didn't ask questions. She simply said, "You saw old Red Tom." Red Tom, she explained, was his great-great-grandfather. Red Tom was a free man, half black and half Creek, living long before my father was born. During the American Civil War, he served as a scout for the Union Army. He knew the land, knew how to move unseen, and knew how to warn others of danger. Later, he served with the U.S. Cavalry in the American West. He was known for carrying 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle, and a Creek war club into battle, the same weapons my father had seen in Vietnam. After telling me this story, my father never spoke of it again. He didn't ask me to believe it. He didn't try to explain it. He simply told me what happened, the way it happened, and left it at that. I've thought about that story many times since his passing. I don't know what it means. I don't know how to explain it, but I know my father. He was not a man who made things up. He didn't chase mystery or fantasy. He believed in facts, discipline, and reality. And yet, in the middle of a jungle halfway across the world, during a war fought a century after the Civil War, something or someone saved his life. Whether Red Tom was a ghost, a guardian, or something else entirely, I can't say. All I know is that without that silent warning, I wouldn't be here today to tell this story. She was a friend of mine during college, someone I knew casually, but well enough that her disappearance shook everyone around us. This happened during our freshman year when everything still felt new and fragile. She was only 18 at the time, still adjusting to college life, still trusting the world more than she probably should have. One weekend, she went to a party at another university about 25 miles north of our school. It wasn't unusual. Students often traveled between campuses for parties, especially on weekends. She didn't go alone. She arrived with another female friend, and I believe that friend was the one driving. It was supposed to be a normal night out, nothing dangerous or unusual. The party itself was large, crowded, loud, and chaotic. The kind of party where people drift in and out of rooms, conversations overlap, and it's easy to lose track of who you arrived with. At some point during the night, she split off from her friend. She told people she was going to play cornhole or just hang out with another group for a bit. No one thought much of it. That kind of thing happened all the time at college parties. Later in the night, her friend started looking for her. At first, it was casual. She assumed she had wandered outside or was talking to someone else. But as more time passed, concerns started to grow. People checked rooms, checked outside, checked cars. Her phone was called again and again. Every call went straight to voicemail. Eventually, panic set in. The police were called. Reports were made. Her family was notified. By the end of the night, it was clear that she was missing. She hadn't left with her friend. She hadn't gone home. No one had seen her leave. She had simply vanished from the party. The days that followed were some of the longest I can remember. Flyers were posted, social media posts spread, students talked about it constantly. Everyone replayed the night in their heads, wondering what they had missed, what they could have done differently. Fear hung over the campus like a heavy cloud. 10 days passed, 10 days with no answers. Then finally, she was found. A homeless man discovered her near a bus stop in the city. He saw her crawling toward it, barely able to move, begging for help. She was in horrific condition. She had a broken leg and a broken arm. She was malnourished, dehydrated, and clearly had been through something terrible. The man immediately called the police and stayed with her until help arrived. What she told authorities afterward was worse than anything anyone had imagined. At the party, someone had secretly drugged her drink. She had no memory of exactly when it happened, only that she began to feel disoriented, weak, and unable to think clearly. A group of men noticed her condition and took advantage of it. They led her away from the party and into a vehicle. She was barely aware of where she was going or who they were. She was taken to an apartment. There she was, repeatedly drugged and raped. She was kept in a small room, locked inside between assaults. The rooms had almost nothing in it. No bed, no comfort, just a bucket she was forced to use as a bathroom. Time blurred together. She lost track of days. She didn't know if anyone was looking for her or if she would ever be found. At one point, after being injected with heroin and assaulted again, she managed to do something extraordinary. Despite being injured, terrified, and drugged, she convinced one of the men to let her use the actual bathroom so she could clean herself. She said later that she didn't even know how she found the words or the strength. She just knew it was her chance. The bathroom had a small window facing outside. She waited until the shower was running, the sound masking everything else. Then she forced herself through the window. It was small and awkward, and her injuries made it even harder. She fell from the 3rd story into a large hedge below. The fall injured her further, but it also saved her life. From there, she crawled. She crawled from the apartment complex toward the road. Every movement was agony. Her leg and arm were broken. She was weak and shaking, but she kept going. She reached the road and then the bus stop, where the homeless man saw her. As people noticed her, cars began to stop. Drivers got out to help. Someone called emergency services. The attention made it impossible for her captors to retrieve her. They had lost control of the situation. Police later used surveillance cameras from nearby areas to track down the apartment she had escaped from. 3 men were arrested and charged for the crimes committed against her. The legal process was long and painful. The recovery was even longer. She didn't return to our university right away. It took almost 2 years before she felt able to come back and continue her education. When she did, she was different. Anyone would have been. The lightness she once had was gone, replaced by caution and strength built from survival. She never partied again, not once. She carried a gun everywhere she legally could. She watched her surroundings constantly. She trusted very few people, but she kept moving forward. She graduated. She became a nurse. Somehow, despite everything that had been done to her, she built a life. She carried trauma with her, but she didn't let it destroy her completely. That, more than anything, left an impression on everyone who knew her. For those of us who were there when she disappeared, the story never left us. It became a reminder of how quickly things can change, how fragile safety really is, and how much strength it can take just to survive. She was only 18 years old when it happened, and none of us ever forgot her story. Many years ago, long before smartphones and instant messages became part of everyday life, we relied on much simpler technology to stay in touch. Back then, cell phones were rare, expensive, and not something most people carried around. Instead, we used pagers. They were small devices clipped to your belt or waistband, always buzzing, always demanding attention. Someone would page you with their phone number, and when you found a phone, you would call them back. That was just how things worked. At the time, I was working as an on-call technician in the audio-visual field. My job required me to be available at almost any hour. If something went wrong at a client's site, I was the person they called. Because of that, my pager went off constantly. It was normal for it to buzz multiple times a day, sometimes even in the middle of the night. I was used to it, and most of the time, it didn't bother me much. There was one rule everyone understood when it came to pagers. If a client added 911 after their phone number, it meant the issue was urgent. It meant stop what you're doing and call immediately. A 911 page wasn't something to ignore. That said, I rarely received them. Most problems weren't true emergencies, and clients usually respected that. One afternoon, I was driving from Orlando to St. Petersburg on Interstate 4. It was a familiar drive, one I had made many times before. Traffic was steady but not terrible, and I was just cruising along, thinking about work and what I still needed to get done that day. Then my pager went off. I glanced down and saw a phone number I didn't recognize. Right after it were the numbers 911. That immediately caught my attention. My first reaction was annoyance, mixed with concern. Who was this, and why was it so urgent? I checked the road, found the nearest exit, and decided to pull off right away. Back then, you couldn't just call someone from your car. You had to find a payphone. I exited the highway and found a small truck stop just outside of Plant City. It wasn't busy at all. It looked like the kind of place truckers might stop for coffee or fuel, but at that moment, it felt quiet and almost empty. The whole process from getting the page to pulling into the lot probably took no more than 3 minutes. I parked, walked inside, and asked the girl behind the counter for some change. She handed me a few quarters, and I headed over to the wall where there were 4 payphones lined up side by side. They were the old kind, heavy and scratched, with faded instruction labels and sticky buttons. I chose one, dropped in my quarter, and dialed the number displayed on my pager. It rang, and rang, and rang. I stood there listening, growing more confused by the second. The call just kept ringing, unanswered. I remember thinking how strange it was. Who pages someone with a 911 and then doesn't answer their phone? That made no sense at all. I was just about to hang up when I noticed something odd. There was another ringing sound, separate from the one in my ear. It was faint at first, but once I paid attention, I couldn't ignore it. I pulled the handset away from my ear and listened. 2 phones down from the one I was using, another payphone was ringing. Not an outgoing ring like mine, but an incoming call. Someone was calling that phone right there on the same wall. I hung up my handset, and immediately the ringing on the other phone stopped. That alone was strange enough to make my stomach tighten. Curious and uneasy, I took a few steps over and picked up the ringing phone. As I did, I looked at the phone number printed above its buttons. Then I looked down at my pager, then back at the phone, then back at the pager again. Except for the 911, the numbers were identical. For a moment, I felt like all the air had been knocked out of me. My chest tightened, and I had this strange sensation, like the room had suddenly tilted. I stood there staring at the phone, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't feel real. It felt wrong, like something that shouldn't be possible. I slowly walked back over to the counter and asked the girl if she had seen anyone use the payphones recently. She looked at me like the question surprised her. She told me I was the only person who had been in the store for the last hour. That made it worse. The whole experience probably lasted no more than 15 minutes, but it felt much longer. By the time I walked back out to my car, the hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up. I felt watched, unsettled, and deeply uncomfortable. All I wanted was to get back on the road and put distance between myself and that place. I pulled back onto the highway and drove. About 10 miles down the road, I saw flashing lights ahead. Traffic slowed, and soon I realized why. There had been a serious accident. It looked like a bomb had gone off on the highway. 4 cars were involved in a massive pileup, along with a tractor-trailer hauling steel. The steel had come loose, scattering across the road. State troopers and paramedics were just arriving on the scene. I pulled over to the side and got out to help however I could. There wasn't much to do. The accident had been violent and sudden. By the time emergency services arrived, the worst had already happened. I won't go into graphic detail, but it was clear that lives had been lost or permanently changed in a matter of seconds. As I stood there, helping where I could, and then stepping back to let professionals take over, my mind kept drifting back to that pager, to that phone number, to the ringing payphone. I don't know who sent that page. I don't know why it came when it did. I don't know how a payphone ended up ringing with the same number that had just paged me, especially when no one else had been there, and I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't pulled over when I did. What I do know is this: if I had ignored that page, even for a few minutes, I would have been right there when that accident happened. I would have been driving at full speed into chaos, steel, and wreckage. I think about that often, even now. Sometimes life gives you warnings you don't understand until much later. Sometimes they come in ways that make no sense at all. And sometimes you don't realize how close you came to disaster until you're already past it. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate. When my parents were in college, long before they were married or even officially dating, they took a trip down to Florida with a group of friends. They had met through mutual friends back home and were part of the same social circle, but at that point, they hadn't gone on a real date yet. There was interest, but nothing had been defined. Like many college students, they were young, carefree, and enjoying the freedom that came with being away from home. The trip to Florida was supposed to be fun and relaxed. Sun, beaches, cheap motels, and long nights hanging out. My dad went with one of his close friends, and my mom went with a group of her own friends. Even though they were part of the same larger group, they weren't attached at the hip. They made loose plans to meet up when they could. One evening, my dad and his friend were supposed to meet my mom and her friends at a hotel. It was nothing serious, just a casual plan to hang out together for the night. But as college guys often do, they lost track of time. They were talking, joking around, and not paying attention to the clock. By the time they realized how late it was, it became obvious that walking to the hotel would take too long. They stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. This was before ride-sharing apps, before easy access to cell phones, before quick solutions. They didn't have a car, and calling a taxi felt unnecessary and expensive. They were young and thought they could handle themselves. So they made a decision that, at the time, didn't seem like a big deal. They decided to hitchhike. It was something people still did back then, especially college students. It felt risky but not dangerous in the way we think of it now. They stood by the road, stuck out their thumbs, and waited. Before long, a car pulled over. Inside were 2 women. One was driving and the other sat in the passenger seat. They seemed normal enough. Friendly, casual, not threatening in any obvious way. My dad and his friend climbed into the back seat, grateful for the ride and relieved that they wouldn't miss meeting my mom and her friends. At first, everything felt fine. The conversation was light. Nothing seemed off. The car moved quickly down the road, and my dad remembers thinking that this had worked out better than expected. They were making good time, and it looked like they would reach the hotel without any trouble. Then the driver asked a question. She turned slightly and asked if it was okay to stop for gas. My dad and his friend didn't think anything of it. Of course, it was fine. She was doing them a favor, after all. They agreed without hesitation, and she pulled into a gas station. She got out, filled her car completely with gas, and then jumped back into the driver's seat. That was when everything changed. Instead of calmly pulling away, she floored it. The tires screeched and the car shot forward out of the gas station. It became immediately clear that she had just stolen the gas. My dad and his friend were thrown back in their seats, stunned and confused. They looked at each other, panic starting to rise. They weren't just hitchhikers anymore. They were now unwilling participants in a crime. Their minds raced. Should they say something? Should they ask her to slow down? Should they demand to be let out? Before either of them could say a word, the driver reached down and pulled a gun from under her seat. She didn't turn around fully. She didn't wave it dramatically. She just held it where they could see it and calmly asked something along the lines of, "Are we going to have a problem?" The question hung in the air. My dad later told me that his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. There was no bravado left, no jokes, no confidence, just pure fear. He and his friend shook their heads as fast as they could. No, absolutely not. Whatever she wanted, they were fine with it. What else do you do in that situation? She put the gun away just as casually as she had pulled it out and continued driving like nothing had happened. The rest of the ride was quiet. No one spoke. The mood had completely changed. My dad and his friend sat perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to say the wrong thing, afraid that any small action might set her off. Every mile felt longer than the last. Finally, she pulled up to the hotel where my mom and her friends were staying. She stopped the car and, without another word, told them to get out. My dad and his friend didn't hesitate. They climbed out as quickly as they could, thanked her out of pure instinct, and watched as she drove away. They stood there for a moment shaking, trying to process what had just happened. But they were alive. They weren't hurt. They hadn't been robbed. They hadn't been shot. In the strange logic of young people, they brushed it off as a crazy story and went inside to meet the others. They didn't call the police. They didn't report the gas theft. They didn't talk about the gun. It was easier to treat it like a wild experience and move on. Time passed. The trip ended. They went back to college. Life continued. My parents eventually started dating, then built a life together. That strange hitchhiking incident faded into the background, something my dad remembered but didn't dwell on. Then, not long after, the news started reporting on a serial killer in Florida. The name Aileen Wuornos began appearing everywhere. News stations talked about murdered men, highway shootings, and a woman who targeted people along the roads. Her face was shown repeatedly on television and in newspapers. When my dad saw her picture, something in him froze. He recognized her immediately. He knew without any doubt that she was the woman who had picked them up. The driver, the woman with the gun, the same voice, the same face, the same calm, dangerous presence. The realization hit him hard. The story suddenly changed from a strange college memory to something much darker. He replayed the entire ride in his head. The gas station, the stolen fuel, the gun, the question, the silence, the drop-off. He realized how close they had come to something far worse. The only reason my dad believes they survived that encounter is because of how they behaved. They were polite, respectful. They didn't flirt. They didn't make jokes. They didn't try to act tough or entitled. They were grateful and non-threatening. Later reports said that her victims were often men who tried to take advantage of her, men who treated her badly or saw her as someone they could control. My dad truly believes that by showing her respect and not pushing boundaries, they didn't trigger whatever switch led her to violence. Looking back, it terrifies him. A simple decision to hitchhike, a few minutes late, one wrong ride, and the outcome could have been completely different. It's strange how life works that way, how close you can come to disaster without ever knowing it in the moment, how one small choice can put you face to face with someone capable of incredible violence. My dad doesn't tell this story lightly. He doesn't dramatize it. He doesn't exaggerate. Every time he talks about it, there's a seriousness in his voice, a quiet awareness of how lucky he was. If things had gone slightly differently, he might not have made it to that hotel. He might not have seen my mom again. He might not have lived the life he eventually built. And the most unsettling part is how normal it all felt at first. Just two college guys, a ride, a casual favor, a few miles down the road. Sometimes danger doesn't announce itself loudly. Sometimes it smiles, offers help, and asks a simple question. And sometimes surviving has nothing to do with strength, and everything to do with being polite, quiet, and lucky enough to be let go. When I was younger, there was one teacher who stayed in my life in a way that still feels strange when I think about it. She was my preschool teacher when I was very little, and then, years later, through a series of job changes and coincidences, she ended up being my English teacher in 11th grade. Most teachers come and go, but she somehow appeared at two completely different stages of my life, and because of that, she always stood out to me. She had lived a life that felt far bigger than the quiet classrooms she taught in. Her family background alone sounded like something out of a novel. Her mother had written a book that was very well known at the time, and her father had worked in a high-level government position. But as interesting as her family was, it wasn't her background that stayed with students the most. It was a story she told every single year without fail. Before I tell that story, there's something important about how she looked. She had dark hair and striking blue eyes. At first, that detail doesn't seem important, but it becomes very important later. She was calm, well-spoken, and serious in a quiet way. When she told stories, she didn't exaggerate or dramatize. She spoke plainly, like someone who didn't need to convince you, because she knew the truth was enough. Every year, at some point during the school term, she would tell her students this story. Not as entertainment, not to scare anyone for fun, but as a reminder, a warning. She always said it happened when she was much younger, long before she became a teacher. She said that at the time, she and her boyfriend were taking a long drive through Arizona. For people who have never been there, it's hard to understand just how empty some parts of that state can feel. There are stretches of road that go on for miles with nothing around. No houses, no stores, no people, just desert, heat, and silence. She was driving her car, and her boyfriend was following behind her on his motorcycle. They weren't racing or fooling around. They were simply traveling together. They both knew where they were going by memory, so they weren't worried about staying right next to each other the entire time. Over the course of the drive, they slowly became separated by a few miles. She said she was comfortable driving alone. She wasn't scared. It was daytime. The road was a two-way highway, but traffic was light. Everything felt normal. At some point, she noticed a car behind her. It was a Volkswagen Beetle. At first, she didn't think anything of it. Cars pass each other all the time, especially on long drives. But then the driver pulled into the opposite lane, even though there was no oncoming traffic, and began motioning at her. He was signaling for her to pull over. She ignored him at first. She said most people would. You don't just pull over because a stranger waves at you on an empty road. But the man didn't stop. He kept pulling up beside her, gesturing more urgently, each time. His movements became more frantic. He looked agitated. She began to think that maybe he had seen something wrong with her car, a flat tire, a broken light, something dangerous. The way he kept insisting made her believe he might actually be trying to help. Eventually, she saw a small parking lot coming up on the side of the road. It belonged to a gas station, but it was deserted. No cars, no people. The building looked closed. Still, it felt like a safer place to pull over than the side of the highway. She turned into the parking lot and stopped her car. The moment she did, She said a feeling washed over her that she couldn't explain. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something colder. A deep sense that something was wrong. The kind of feeling that makes your stomach tighten without knowing why. The man pulled in behind her. He got out of his car and walked toward her. She said there was something about him that immediately made her uneasy. The way he stood, the way he spoke, the way his eyes stayed on her. He told her that something was wrong with her headlight. He insisted that she needed to get out of the car so he could show her. She hesitated. Every instinct she had told her not to leave her car. The feeling she had only grew stronger. She said that looking back, she realized how close she was to ignoring that instinct because she didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. She cracked the door but didn't fully step out right away. The man kept pushing. He kept insisting. He told her she had to come look. He said it was important. Meanwhile, her boyfriend was still riding behind her, closing the distance. He had noticed she was no longer ahead of him and began to worry. As he came over a rise in the road, he saw her car pulled over at the deserted gas station. He immediately turned in. At the exact moment she finally stepped out of her car, her boyfriend's motorcycle pulled into the parking lot. Everything changed instantly. The man's entire demeanor shifted. Without saying a word, he turned around, got back into his Volkswagen Beetle, and sped away so fast it looked like he was running for his life. Tires kicked up dust as he disappeared back onto the highway. Her boyfriend jumped off his motorcycle and ran to her. He asked if she was okay. She was shaking. She told him what had just happened. They both stood there in silence for a moment, letting it sink in. At the time they were shaken, but they didn't fully understand how close she had come to something terrible. They talked about it, but eventually life moved on. The drive continued. The incident became something strange and unsettling, but not yet horrifying. That came later. Sometime after that trip, news reports began circulating about a serial killer. His face was everywhere. His name was Ted Bundy. He was being connected to the disappearances and murders of young women across multiple states. When she saw his picture, her blood ran cold. She recognized him immediately. The dark hair, the eyes, the face, the calm, almost friendly appearance that hid something deeply wrong. She knew without a doubt that he was the man who had pulled her over in the desert. She said that realization hit her harder than anything else in her life. She replayed the moment again and again in her mind. The deserted gas station, the insistence, the way he wanted her out of the car, the way he fled the second another man appeared. She told her students every year that she truly believed she would not be alive if her boyfriend had been even 3 miles farther behind her. 3 miles, a distance so small it feels meaningless until you realize it can be the difference between life and death. She never told the story in a dramatic way. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stated the facts and let them sit in the room. You could feel the silence afterward. Every student understood that this wasn't a scary story meant for fun. This was real. She always ended the story with the same message. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Politeness is not worth your safety. You do not owe strangers your time, your attention, or your trust. That story stayed with me long after I left her class. Even now, years later, I think about it when I'm driving alone, or when someone tries to get my attention in a place that feels unsafe. I think about how easily things can turn dark, how quickly normal moments can become dangerous. She went on to live a full life. She became a teacher who impacted countless students. She survived something most people never even come close to, and she made sure that her experience didn't go to waste by using it to warn others. What makes the story truly terrifying isn't just who the man was. It's how ordinary it all felt at the time. A road trip, a stranger offering help, a moment of hesitation. Sometimes danger doesn't look like danger at all. Sometimes it looks like a man in a small car, waving you over on a quiet road, pretending to be helpful. And sometimes survival comes down to timing, instinct, and the sudden appearance of someone who wasn't supposed to be there yet. A while back, a group of girls from my friend circle decided to go out for a night together. They wanted to dance, drink a little, and just let loose after a long week. They ended up going to a local gay club, which was known as a generally safe place, especially for women. It was the kind of spot where people felt comfortable being themselves, where aggressive behavior usually wasn't tolerated, and where the atmosphere felt more protective than most regular clubs. For some reason, I didn't go with them that night. I honestly don't even remember why anymore. At the time, it probably felt like no big deal. Looking back now, I have mixed feelings about it. Part of me is relieved I wasn't there because what happened was terrifying. Another part of me wishes I had been there because maybe I could have helped, or at least shared the responsibility of stepping in. That night, while my friends were on the dance floor, they noticed something that immediately felt wrong. There was a girl dancing, or at least standing in the middle of the crowd, who looked completely out of place. She wasn't dressed like anyone else there. Instead of club clothes, she was wearing sweatpants and a plain t-shirt. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail. On top of all that, she had a backpack on her shoulders. That alone would have stood out anywhere, but especially in a club. People usually plan their outfits carefully when they go out. They dress to feel confident, attractive, or expressive. This girl looked like she had walked in straight from running errands or heading to class. Not like someone who had planned a night of dancing, but her clothes weren't the most concerning thing. My friends said she looked completely dazed. Her eyes were unfocused. She wasn't really moving to the music. She wasn't smiling, laughing, or engaging with anyone around her. She just stood there, almost swaying, like she was barely aware of where she was. And there was a man with her. He was very large, much bigger than her, and he had his hands all over her. He was grabbing her and grinding against her aggressively. What made it worse was that she wasn't responding at all. She wasn't pushing him away, but she also wasn't participating. She just stood there, letting it happen, like she didn't have the energy or awareness to react. That set off alarm bells immediately. One of my friends decided to approach her. She tried to be casual and friendly, moving close and asking if she was okay. Before the girl could even respond, the man stepped in and answered for her. He said very firmly that the girl was his girlfriend. He claimed she had just had too much to drink and that she was fine. Something about the way he said it made everyone uneasy. He was defensive, too quick, too controlling. He didn't let the girl speak at all. He positioned himself between them, like he was guarding her. My friends backed off for the moment. They didn't want to cause a scene or make things worse if they were wrong. But none of them believed his explanation. The situation didn't sit right with any of them, so they decided to keep watching. They stayed nearby, keeping the man and the girl in their line of sight. They watched how he interacted with her. He guided her by the arm. He whispered things in her ear. She barely reacted to anything. She looked less drunk and more empty. Eventually, the man left the dance floor and went toward the bar. That was the opening my friends needed. One of them immediately went back to the girl and tried again to talk to her. This time, without the man hovering over her, they were able to get a clearer picture of what was going on. The girl was barely coherent. She struggled to focus on the conversation. Her words were slow and slurred, but not in a way that matched typical drunkenness. She seemed confused about where she was and how long she had been there. My friend said it felt much more like she had been drugged than just drinking too much. With effort, the girl managed to communicate a few terrifying things. She said she didn't know the man. She said she didn't come to the club with him. and she said she wanted to leave. That was all my friend needed to hear. She grabbed the girl's hand, wrapped an arm around her, and started heading for the exit. The plan was simple. Get out of the club, get somewhere safe, figure everything else out later. But they didn't make it far. The man came back from the bar and immediately realized what was happening. The second he saw my friend trying to lead the girl away, he exploded. His entire demeanor changed. He rushed toward them, got right in my friend's face, and started screaming at her. He accused her of kidnapping. He yelled that the girl was his girlfriend. He demanded she let go of her immediately. My friend tried to stay calm, but the situation escalated fast. The man got closer. His face was inches from hers. He was spitting as he yelled. People around them started to notice, but no one immediately stepped in. The noise, the music, the chaos of the club made everything feel unreal and out of control. Then he swung at her. It happened so fast that she barely had time to react. She managed to dodge the punch by inches. If she hadn't moved when she did, he would have hit her square in the face. At that point, everything felt like it could go horribly wrong. Thankfully, someone else had already gone to get security. A guard arrived just in time to intervene before the man could hurt anyone. The guard stepped between them and forced the man back. Other staff members came over. The man was restrained and removed from the immediate area. That intervention likely prevented serious injuries or worse. With the man distracted and contained, my friends took the opportunity to leave immediately. They got the girl out of the club and into fresh air as fast as they could. She was still extremely out of it. She could barely walk on her own. They supported her, helped her into a car, and got her away from that place. Outside the club, they tried to get more information from her, but it was difficult. She was still heavily impaired. She couldn't clearly explain what had happened to her earlier in the day, or how she ended up at the club with that man. One thing she did manage to say, though, made the situation even scarier. She said the man had been following her around town all day, not just at the club, all day. That realization made everything worse. It meant this wasn't random, it wasn't a misunderstanding, it wasn't a drunken hookup gone wrong. This man had likely targeted her, followed her, and waited for an opportunity to isolate and control her. The night eventually ended with my friends making sure the girl was safe and with people she trusted. But the fear didn't go away. What makes the entire situation even more unsettling is what happened afterward. Once my friends left with the girl, the bar staff couldn't actually do much else. Since the girl was gone and hadn't personally reported anything at that moment, all they could legally do was throw the man out of the club. They banned him from the premises, but that was it. One of my friends did call the police and gave them a description of the man. The response was frustrating and deeply unsettling. The police said there wasn't much they could do without a formal complaint from the victim. They said they would be on the lookout, but there was no immediate action they could take, so that was it. The man was removed from the club, and then he was back out on the street. The thought of that still makes my stomach turn. The idea that someone could act that aggressively, that suspiciously, and still walk away with no real consequences is terrifying. There was no guarantee he wouldn't do it again. No guarantee he wouldn't follow another woman. No guarantee he wouldn't succeed next time. That's the part that sticks with me the most. Not just what happened, but how close it came to being so much worse. How easily the situation could have ended differently if my friends hadn't trusted their instincts, if they had decided it wasn't their place to interfere, if they had believed the man's lie and walked away. It's terrifying to think about how many situations like this might go unnoticed. How many times people look the other way because they don't want to cause trouble. How many predators rely on that hesitation. That night reinforced something important for all of us. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If someone looks like they need help, they probably do. And sometimes stepping in, even when it's uncomfortable or scary, can be the difference between someone getting home safely and something far worse happening. The scariest part is knowing that man is likely still out there somewhere, and knowing that without people willing to step in, he may try again. This happened about 9 years ago, and even now, when I think about it, the memory sits heavy in my chest. It isn't the kind of story that fades with time. If anything, it has only grown stranger the more distance I've put between myself and it. At the time, I was working as an underground engineer at a massive mining site. When I say underground, I don't mean a few tunnels or a small operation beneath the surface. I mean miles down, so far beneath the earth that the surface felt like a myth more than a place. I worked with enormous machinery, systems so large and complex that a single mistake could cost lives. My specific responsibility was maintaining a large industrial boiler. There wasn't just one boiler. There were more than a dozen of them, each towering roughly 30 feet high, thick metal giants that ran non-stop, day and night. Each boiler had a small team of engineers assigned to it, working in shifts to make sure it never stopped running. These boilers were the heart of everything. They didn't just power the mining shafts. They powered an entire city that existed underground. A real city. Streets, buildings, schools, shops, government offices, homes. A place where tens of thousands of people lived full lives without ever seeing the sky. We're talking about roughly 20,000 people depending on those systems every single moment. The boilers broke down constantly. They were pushed beyond what they were ever designed to handle. Makeshift repairs were routine. You didn't replace parts the way you would in a normal facility. You reinforced, reshaped, welded, improvised. You learned every sound, every vibration, every slight change in pressure that might mean something was about to fail. If more than 4 boilers went down at the same time, power to the residential sectors would be cut to keep the industrial sector alive. That was always the priority. If the industrial sector lost power, the air circulation systems would fail. The pumps that brought breathable air through the city would stop. And if that happened, people didn't just lose electricity. They suffocated. Everyone knew this. It wasn't hidden. It was just a fact of life. No one had been to the surface in decades. There had been some kind of pestilence, some kind of ongoing danger, though even that felt vague in my memory, like a threat everyone accepted but rarely spoke about in detail. Whatever was up there, it was worse than staying below. This was a fully self-contained world. There were politicians who governed the city, teachers who taught children, service workers who cleaned streets and repaired homes, weavers who made clothing, cooks who fed thousands every day, doctors, mechanics. Everyone had a role. Everyone worked. That was how survival functioned. I had a family. My wife worked at the school. She taught children, including our own. We had 3 kids. Our oldest, Robert, was 13 at the time. In 3 years, he would turn 16, which meant he would leave school and start working, just like everyone else. The other 2 were younger, still small enough to cling to stuffed animals and fall asleep wherever they sat. I can still remember them clearly. I remember our house. It wasn't large, but it was comfortable. I can picture the layout perfectly, the way the furniture was arranged, the little decorations my wife liked to collect, the small imperfections in the walls, the children's blankets, their teddies, their beds. I remember the way the lighting cast long shadows down the street outside. I remember neighbors, faces, names, personalities. I remember arguments, friendships, shared meals, small celebrations. I remember walking through the city and recognizing hundreds of people, knowing where they worked, who they lived with, what kind of person they were. At the time, I was in my mid-30s. I wasn't new to this world. I had decades of memories built inside it, years of routine, years of responsibility, years of love, stress, exhaustion, pride. It felt like a complete, fully lived life. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. I woke up. I put that word in quotes because I was already awake, or at least it felt that way. But something was wrong immediately. The first thing I noticed was the light. It was bright, blinding, white. Nothing like the orange sodium lamps that lit the underground city. That alone made my head spin. I was confused, disoriented. My body felt weak, heavy, unfamiliar. There were faces around me, people talking, asking questions. I recognized some of them, or at least my brain thought it did, but the recognition didn't connect to anything solid. It was like knowing a word but forgetting its meaning. I tried to understand where I was. I tried to remember how I got there. My thoughts felt scrambled, like they were sliding off each other before I could grab onto them. Slowly, reality began to push its way in. I was in a hospital. I had contracted a serious bacterial infection. I'd been running a dangerously high fever. I had been unconscious for several days. No more than 4, according to the doctors. 4 days. That was all. In those 4 days, my brain had created an entire world. A city, a career, a wife, children, friends, decades of memories layered on top of each other with incredible detail and emotional weight. None of it was real. I tried to talk about it. I told my girlfriend at the time what I had experienced, what I remembered. She listened, but her focus was understandably on how close I had come to something far worse. How serious my condition had been. How lucky I was to be alive. After that, I stopped talking about it. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. How do you explain that you miss people who never existed? That you feel grief for children who were never born? That you remember a home that was never built? This wasn't like a typical hallucination. It wasn't random images or nonsense. I wasn't seeing impossible creatures or warped reality. This was structured, logical, consistent. It followed rules. Cause and effect existed. Time passed. People aged. Systems broke and were repaired. I had memories stretching back nearly 30 years inside my head, and yet none of it had happened. That realization broke something in me. For a long time afterward, I fell into a deep depression. I felt hollow, detached. I would look at real people and feel distant, as if they were less solid than the ones I remembered from the underground city. I felt like I had lost something precious and irreplaceable, even though I knew, logically, that it had never truly existed. I left out many details when I first tried to tell this story. I still do. Even now, writing this, there are moments I hesitate. Certain memories still feel too heavy, too intimate, too painful to fully describe. 9 years later, they still make me feel somber, reflective, unsettled. What scared me the most wasn't the illness. It was what my brain was capable of. The fact that my mind could generate something so detailed, so emotionally rich, so convincing, without any external input. That it could make me love people who weren't real. That it could make me feel responsibility, fear, pride, and grief for a world that existed only inside my head. Sometimes, even now, I'll catch myself remembering a face, a street, a sound from that underground city. And for a split second, it feels real again. And then the weight of knowing it settles back in. It changed how I think about reality. It made me question how fragile our sense of self really is, how thin the line is between what we experience and what we believe to be true. It made me realize that memory doesn't care whether something actually happened. If it feels real enough, it becomes part of you anyway. That's the part that still scares me. Not that my brain lied to me, but that it did such a perfect job of it. This happened a few years ago, but even now, thinking about it still sends a cold feeling down my spine. It's one of those moments where everything seems small and ordinary at first, and then later you realize how close things came to going very wrong. At the time, my wife was staying at her parents' house. She wasn't living there by choice or convenience, but because her father was dealing with serious health issues. The kind of issues that change daily routines, bring stress into the home, and make everyone more alert but also more tired than usual. She spent a lot of time going back and forth, helping where she could, trying to be present for her family. That evening, she arrived at the house, like she had many times before. It was already dark outside, but nothing felt unusual. The neighborhood was a quiet, residential area, the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where doors are usually locked out of habit, not fear, a place that feels safe. She unlocked the front door and went inside. At the time, no one else was home. Her parents were out, and the house was empty except for the pets. Instead of walking deeper into the house, she stopped in the first room just off the entrance. It was a small room that held the family computers, basically a little office space right near the front door. She set her things down, sat at the computer, and started browsing the internet. Nothing urgent, nothing stressful, just killing time, decompressing a little after the drive. A few minutes later, one of the cats came into the room. Not just any cat, her cat. This cat had been with her for years. He was older, calm, and almost impossibly gentle. He was the kind of cat people joked about not having a survival instinct. He loved everyone, strangers, kids, other animals. It didn't matter. He never hissed, never growled, never showed aggression. There was a running joke in the family about how relaxed he was. You could pick him up at any time, disturb him while he slept, or move him from place to place, and he would barely react. He was the type of cat who would lie in the yard while squirrels threw pecans at him from the trees, and he wouldn't even flinch. Just blink slowly and continue existing. That was the cat my wife knew. But that night, the cat that walked into the room was not behaving like himself. He didn't come over for attention. He didn't rub against her legs. He didn't jump onto a chair or desk. Instead, he stopped in the doorway that led from the computer room into the rest of the house. And he stood there. At first, my wife didn't think much of it. She noticed him out of the corner of her eye, but she was focused on the screen. Then she heard it. A low growl. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A sound she had never heard from him before. She turned in her chair to look at him more closely. The cat was standing stiff, body tense, fur slightly raised. He was facing into the house, not toward her. Every few seconds, he would growl again. Then hiss, not constantly, but in short bursts like warnings. He was positioned directly between her and the entrance to the rest of the house. That alone made her uneasy. She spoke to him softly, trying to calm him, called his name. Usually, that would have been enough for him to relax or come over to her. This time, he didn't move. He didn't even look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the dark hallway beyond the doorway. Then he growled again, deeper this time. The longer it went on, the more wrong it felt. This wasn't playful. This wasn't random. This was defensive, protective, like he was guarding her from something she couldn't see. My wife later told me that every instinct in her body started screaming that something was not right. She didn't hear noises. She didn't see movement. But the way the cat was acting made her skin crawl. This was an animal that never reacted to anything, and now he looked like he was ready to attack. She stood up slowly, keeping her eyes on him. The cat didn't back away. If anything, he seemed more focused, more alert. His body language was clear. Whatever he sensed, it was serious. That was the moment she decided she wasn't staying. She walked over, gently picked him up, and held him close. He didn't fight her. He didn't calm down either. He stayed tense in her arms, still staring toward the rest of the house. still growling under his breath. She didn't go any farther inside. She walked straight back out the front door and left the house. Once outside, she moved away from the entrance and stood on the front walkway, trying to steady her breathing. Her heart was pounding. She felt foolish for being scared, but also terrified that she might be ignoring something important. As she stood there, a patrol car drove slowly down the street. That alone was unusual. This wasn't an area where police cars regularly patrolled at night. It wasn't a high-crime neighborhood. Seeing flashing lights or cruisers was rare enough that people noticed when it happened. Without thinking too much about it, she waved them down. The officer stopped, rolled down the window, and asked if everything was okay. She explained what had just happened, that she had just arrived home, that no one else was supposed to be there, and that her normally calm cat was acting extremely aggressive, like he was guarding her from something inside the house. The officers exchanged a look. They didn't laugh. They didn't brush it off. Their tone changed immediately. They told her to get into the back of the cruiser and stay there. Not asked, told. They said they would check the house. She sat in the car, clutching her cat, watching as the two officers approached the house cautiously. They drew their weapons before entering. That alone made her stomach drop. A few minutes passed, then more. Time stretched in that awful way where every second feels heavy. She watched the front door, listened for raised voices, for shouting, for anything. Eventually, one of the officers came back outside. The look on his face confirmed that something had been very wrong. They told her that the back door of the house had been wide open, not unlocked. Open. This was deeply disturbing for one simple reason. Her parents were obsessive about locking doors. My wife was too. They never left doors unlocked, especially not open, ever. It wasn't a habit, it wasn't forgetfulness, it was a rule. The officers searched the house thoroughly. No one was inside by the time they arrived. Whoever had been there was gone. Later, after everything had settled a bit, the officers told her something else, something they hadn't said at first. They were actively searching the area for a serial rapist. There had been reports, sightings, enough concern that patrols had been increased, even in normally safe neighborhoods. That was why the cruiser had been driving slowly down her street that night. Hearing that made her feel sick. The realization hit all at once. Someone had likely been inside the house. Someone dangerous. Someone who might have heard her enter. Someone who might have been moving through the house when she stopped in that first room. And the only reason she hadn't walked farther inside was because her cat had stopped her. The cat had sensed something before she ever did. If she had gone deeper into the house, if she had followed her normal routine, if she had ignored the cat's behavior, things could have gone very differently. That thought still makes my chest tighten. The officers advised her not to stay there that night. Arrangements were made. The back door was secured. The house was checked again. But the feeling of safety was gone. Even now, years later, we talk about it sometimes. About how close that moment was to becoming something much worse. About how instincts don't always come from our own minds. Sometimes they come from animals. Sometimes they come from a quiet warning that doesn't make logical sense in the moment. Her cat went back to being his usual calm, gentle self afterward. Never acted like that again. Never growled or hissed the same way. But that night, he knew. And because of him, my wife walked away unharmed. If there's one lesson to take from all of this, it's simple. Always trust the cat. My brother would get really bad night terrors in the house he was born in, and they were nothing like normal nightmares. From the time he was very young, There were nights when he would suddenly start screaming in a way that didn't sound human. It wasn't just fear, it sounded like pain. When my parents rushed into the room, he would be sitting up in bed with his eyes open, breathing fast, his face twisted in terror. The scariest part was that he looked awake, but he wasn't really there. No matter how much they called his name or tried to shake him, he couldn't respond. These episodes happened often, sometimes several times a week. During them, he would act like he was trapped inside something terrible that only he could see or feel. He would scream about being hurt, about someone attacking him, about unbearable pain. One time he woke up crying and clutching his hands, insisting that a man had crushed his fingers in a drawer. He screamed that he could still feel it, even though there was no mark, no injury, nothing that explained the pain he described. He cried for hours afterward, shaking and refusing to sleep again. I shared a room with him, so I saw and heard everything. I remember lying in my bed, frozen, listening to his screams in the dark. Sometimes I was too scared to move. Other times I pulled the blanket over my head and prayed it would stop. There were nights when I pretended to be asleep, even though I was wide awake, afraid that whatever was hurting him might notice me, too. What made it even worse was that sometimes he didn't just talk about pain. Sometimes he talked about seeing things. He would point to corners of the room or stare at empty space near the door and say there was an old man standing there. He described the man in detail. He said the man watched us. He said the man would come closer when the lights were off. I never saw anything myself, but the way my brother spoke about it was calm and certain, not like a child making things up. My parents were terrified and exhausted. They took him to doctors, specialists, and therapists. He went through tests and evaluations. The doctors said they were night terrors, maybe caused by stress, imagination, or an overactive mind. But they couldn't explain why they were so intense, so violent, or why he could describe pain that felt so real. No medication helped. No routine fixed it, nothing changed. As time passed, my mother became convinced there was something wrong with the house itself. It was the house my brother was born in, an older place with creaky floors and strange cold spots. At night, it always felt heavier somehow. Even during the day, there were rooms that felt uncomfortable to sit in for too long. Things would go missing and show up later in strange places. Doors sometimes felt like they were being watched. Eventually, my mom decided to get outside help. She contacted someone who claimed to read spirits or sense energy. I remember thinking it sounded strange, but my mom was desperate. When the woman came to the house, she walked through each room slowly and quietly. She said the house carried something dark, something old. She said there was a presence attached to the place, not to any one person, and that children were more sensitive to it. She told my mom that my brother wasn't imagining things. According to her, the house was haunted. That word stayed with me, haunted. We didn't move right away. Life got in the way, and my parents tried to cope as best they could. My brother's night terrors continued. I learned to sleep lightly, always listening. My parents learned how to calm him down when he came out of an episode, holding him until he stopped shaking. Every night felt like waiting for something terrible to happen. 2 years ago, we finally moved out of that house. The change was immediate. From the first night in the new place, my brother slept quietly. No screaming, no crying, no talking about pain or old men in the room. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Not a single night terror, not one. At first, we thought it was a coincidence. Maybe he had grown out of it. Maybe the doctors had been right all along. But as more time passed, it became impossible to ignore. Years of constant terror had stopped the moment we left that house. Even now, he has not had a single episode. Looking back, the truth feels unsettling but clear. Whatever was causing those night terrors was tied to that place. Not stress, not imagination, not illness. The house itself had something in it, something that affected him in ways no doctor could explain. I still think about those nights. I still remember the sound of his screams, the way the room felt when the lights were off, and the fear that settled deep into my chest. We left the house behind, but the memories never fully went away. Some places hold on to things, and sometimes the only way to escape them is to leave. The rain arrived heavier than any of them expected. At first, they tried to keep moving along the narrow mountain trail, telling themselves it would ease up soon. But the storm only grew stronger, soaking through their jackets, their backpacks, and finally, their sleeping bags. Water ran in cold sheets down their faces. The trail turned to mud beneath their boots. Their phones died one by one until nobody could even check the time, let alone their location. After a while, it became hard to tell how long they had been walking, and nobody could remember the last time they had seen another hiker. It felt as if the mountain had swallowed them whole. When the wind picked up, one of them suggested leaving the trail and taking shelter in the woods. The others agreed without argument. They pushed through the crowded trees, slipping between wet branches until they spotted a shape in the distance, a structure. It was the faintest outline of a house, almost hidden by the thick forest. At first it looked like part of the landscape, something old that the mountain itself was slowly reclaiming. But as they got closer, they could see the corners, the sagging boards, the broken roofline. It was definitely a house, abandoned, decayed, but still standing. A relief rushed through the group. Any shelter was better than none. The roof had collapsed on one side, letting the storm pour straight into whatever had once been a bedroom. But the other half of the house seemed intact. The windows were dark and hollow like empty eyes, but the walls were solid enough. It didn't matter that the place looked forgotten. They needed to get out of the rain, and they needed it now. They pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The change was immediate. No more rain hammering their shoulders, no more wind slicing at their skin. The air inside was cool and still. Dust hung in the darkness like a soft fog. It was so quiet that at first none of them wanted to speak. The entire house felt paused, as if it had been waiting for years for someone to come through the door again. One of them finally muttered, "At least it's dry." The others nodded and set their dripping gear down. They took a moment to breathe, then looked around. The living room still held the outline of an old couch frame, long since torn apart by weather and animals. A few boards of the floor creaked under their weight, but nothing collapsed. For a place that must have sat alone for decades, it held together better than expected. They lit emergency candles, their tiny flames flickering against the peeling walls. The room filled with soft, warm light, and for a moment the tension in their shoulders eased. They unrolled their wet sleeping bags in a rough circle, planning to dry them as much as possible before trying to rest. No one felt truly calm, but they were exhausted enough that comfort mattered less than survival. After a few minutes, one of them wandered off, carrying his candle toward the hallway. The corridor was narrow and lined with doors, each one slightly crooked on its hinges. He tapped on a few of them, trying to guess what the rooms behind them once looked like. Most of them opened without trouble, revealing empty closets or dust-covered floors. Then he came to a door that wouldn't move. He pushed the knob again. Nothing. The door wasn't locked. It just seemed stuck. The wood had swollen from decades of humidity, wedging itself tightly into the frame. He leaned his shoulder into it, grunting softly, but it refused to budge. There was a small gap along one side where the wood had cracked, narrow but just enough to see through. Curious and half bored, he lowered himself, pressed his face close to the frame, and put one eye to the crack. At first he saw nothing, just darkness. But as his eye adjusted, a shape slowly formed. Not a shape, a color. Red, a deep, thick, crimson glow spreading across his whole vision. Not a line or a patch, but a complete wash of red filling everything from edge to edge. He blinked a few times, thinking maybe the candlelight was playing tricks on him, but the red stayed where it was. Full, heavy, unmoving. Without saying anything, he backed away and called for the others. They came over, curious about what he'd found. One by one, they lowered themselves to the floor. One by one, they pressed their faces to the crack. And one by one, they saw the same thing. Red. Only red. Nothing else. Someone whispered, "Everything's just red." Another shrugged. Maybe the room was painted that way. Could have been a photography darkroom. They tried to explain it in soft, tired voices. Old paint, maybe. A trick of the light. Mineral stains. Anything that made even a little sense. But the more they talked about it, the stranger it felt. The house didn't seem like the sort of place that would have a darkroom. And the color they saw, none of them could describe it exactly. It didn't look like paint. It didn't look like light. It didn't feel like it belonged to the room at all. Still, nothing about the house seemed dangerous. So after their brief curiosity faded, they returned to the living room. They were too worn out to worry about mysterious colors behind stuck doors. They were cold, damp, and drained. Whatever was behind that door could be ignored until morning. They laid out their sleeping bags, some still dripping rainwater, and stretched out on the uneven floor. The storm outside roared through the forest, shaking branches and sending gusts against the house. But inside, it remained silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every breath seem louder than it should be. None of them slept well. Some of them didn't sleep at all, drifting in and out of uneasy dreams. Each time they opened their eyes, the flickering candlelight made the shadows crawl along the walls like slow-moving hands. When morning finally broke, pale sunlight leaked through the broken windows. The storm had passed. The air smelled clean and fresh, carrying a hint of pine and wet soil. They packed up quickly, none of them wanting to stay any longer than necessary. Something about the house felt different in the daylight, emptier, colder. Nobody spoke about the red room. They told themselves it had been nothing, and somehow that was enough. By the time they reached the main trail again, the house felt like a strange memory they weren't sure they had experienced at all. They reached the town by late morning, a small, quiet place with a single diner that looked like it had been there for decades. The moment they stepped inside, the familiar warmth of greasy food and fresh coffee wrapped around them, the clatter of dishes, the soft hum of conversation, the smell of toast. It was everything they needed after a long night. They slid into a booth and ordered breakfast. The waitress brought water and hot coffee, smiling the way small-town servers often do when strangers wander in. She asked if they had been camping and how badly the storm had treated them. "We stayed in an old house on the mountain," one of them answered. "Abandoned place not too far from here." The reaction was immediate. The entire diner went silent. Forks stopped mid-air. Conversations cut off without finishing their sentences. Even the music playing quietly in the background seemed to fade. The waitress froze, the coffee pot hovering just above one of their cups. Her smile thinned. Her eyes widened only a fraction, but it was enough to show she wasn't comfortable anymore. The owner, an older man with a heavy build and a gray beard, looked up from behind the counter. He walked over slowly, wiping his hands on a towel, his expression controlled and careful. "The house in the forest?" he asked. They nodded. "We just waited out the storm," someone said. "You went inside?" "Yeah, there was this room. The door was stuck. We looked through the crack. Everything inside looked completely red." The silence deepened even more, settling over the diner like a heavy blanket. The waitress set the coffee pot down without pouring. She whispered, barely loud enough to hear, "You looked into the room." The owner pulled out a chair and sat across from them. His eyes swept over each of their faces, as if checking for something he wasn't sure he wanted to find. He folded his hands on the table and took a long breath before speaking. "There's a story people tell about that place," he said slowly. "If tonight's stories stayed with you, leave a like. Subscribe if you're drawn to the quiet kind of horror, the kind that doesn't need to shout. Some things don't chase you, they just wait. This is LURK. I'll see you next time.